Tonight, we're diving into a kinder turning of a famous tragedy. The story of a noble house that, in the tale most people know, was betrayed and broken on the sands of a desert world, and of what might have been if, this once, it had not fallen. Imagine House Atreides at the height of its honor, Duke Leto the Just, his lady Jessica, their son Paul. And imagine that the trap laid for them on Arrakis was seen in time and sprung in vain, so that the Duke lived, and his house endured, and the desert became not their grave, but their long home. Settle in now. Let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve, and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters, we will move without haste through a house that did not fall, through a desert alliance kept, through a father who lived to see his son grow, and through the slow greening of a world that once knew only sand. You do not need to remember any of it. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, softly, down toward sleep. Far out among the scattered lights of the old empire, on a world of gray seas and gentle rain, House Atreides stood at the very height of its honor. The planet was called Caladan, and it had belonged to the Atreides line for 26 generations, long enough that the name of the family and the name of the world had grown into each other, like two old trees sharing a single soil. Here the tides came in slow and patient across the pebbled shore, and the fishermen sang low songs to the pull of the moons, and the rains fell soft as breath against the high windows of the ancestral castle. It was a place made for rest, and tonight we begin there. In the last long season of its quiet, before the great change came, the lord of that castle was Duke Leto, the first of his name, and the people who lived beneath his rule loved him with a loyalty that could not be bought. He was a tall man of dark hair and grave eyes, and he carried himself with the calm of someone who had learned that true strength never needs to raise its voice. He had ruled through lean years and full ones, and in each of them he had chosen fairness over profit and mercy over the easy cruelty of power. The moss fishermen and the Pundi rice farmers, the pilots and the guardsmen, all of them knew that when they brought a grievance to their duke, he would listen with his whole attention, and this alone made them ready to follow him anywhere. A ruler who is feared may command obedience, but a ruler who is trusted commands something far deeper, and Leto had gathered that deeper thing to himself over many patient years. Beside him moved the Lady Jessica, who was his bound concubine and the mother of his son. Though, in every way that mattered, she was his equal and his partner. She had come to Caladan out of the schools of the Bene Gesserit, that ancient sisterhood of women who trained their bodies and their minds to a fineness beyond ordinary understanding. From them she had learned to read the smallest flicker of muscle in a face, to steady her own heart with a thought, to move through a crowded hall and know the mood of every person in it. Yet for all her training, Jessica had done a thing the sisterhood had not asked of her. She had loved Leto, truly and without reservation, and she had borne him a son when she had been instructed to bear a daughter. That single act of love, quiet as it was, would ripple far into the years to come, though on these soft Caladan nights it seemed only a mother's tender choice. The son was named Paul, and he was a boy on the threshold of becoming a young man. He was slighter than his father and darker than his mother, with a watchful stillness that made older people forget how young he truly was. He had been taught from many directions at once, and he had absorbed it all the way dry ground drinks the first rain. His mind moved quickly and quietly, and sometimes, in the drifting moments between waking and sleep, he dreamed of places he had never seen, of caverns of stone and rivers of sand, and a girl with eyes the color of deep water. He did not yet know what these dreams meant. He only knew that they came, and that they left behind them a strange, warm certainty, as though some part of him were remembering a life he had not yet lived. Around this small family gathered a company of remarkable men, each one bound to the Atreides, not by fear, but by devotion. There was Gurney Halleck, the War Master, a scarred and thick-set man with an ink-vine welt curling down his jaw, who could break a body in single combat, and then, in the same evening, take up a 9-stringed baliset and sing until grown soldiers wept for the sweetness of it. There was Duncan Idaho, the Swordmaster, young and bold and laughing, quick as water and faithful as stone, who loved Paul like a younger brother and would have walked into any fire for the sake of the house. There was Thufir Hawat, the Mentat, an old master of assassins and calculation whose mind worked like a great engine of logic, sifting every fact and rumor for the shape of hidden danger. And there was the physician, Dr. Wellington Huey, gentle and learned, his lips stained the dark red of the sappho juice, bearing upon his forehead the diamond tattoo that marked him as conditioned by the Suk school against any betrayal of his patient. Each of these men had given the best of himself to the service of the Duke, and the house was stronger for the sum of them. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done, the castle settled into a warmth that no wealth could have purchased. Gurney's music drifted down the stone corridors. Duncan told exaggerated stories of duels won by the narrowest of margins. Thufir sat apart with his ledgers and his silences, and old Yue spoke softly with Paul about the histories of far worlds. Jessica watched over all of it with the quiet attention of a woman who has learned to treasure the ordinary hours, because she of all of them sensed, in the deep places of her training, that ordinary hours are the rarest treasure a great house is ever given. For House Atreides was not only a family and a household, it was a great house of the Landsraad, one of the noble lines that shared power with the Padishah Emperor across the 1,000 worlds of the Imperium. In the vast councils of that empire, the name of Atreides had begun to shine with a brightness that drew many eyes. Leto was spoken of as a leader of men, as a duke whose soldiers fought with a loyalty that could not be manufactured, whose desert-hardened troops and whose sea-born fighters were reckoned among the finest anywhere. And a house that shines too brightly in an empire built on jealousy and balance is a house that begins, quietly, to gather enemies. Leto knew this. He had always known it. It was the shadow that lay beneath his calm, the price of the very honor his people loved him for. So the days on Caladan turned gently, one into the next, rain and tide and song, and the family lived in the fullness of a happiness they could not keep. There is a particular sweetness in a thing that is about to change, and though none of them could have named it, all of them felt it in those last quiet weeks. Leto walked the shore alone in the mornings and looked out at the gray water. Jessica held her son a moment longer than she needed to when she wished him good night. Paul dreamed his dreams of sand and stone. And out beyond the moons, beyond the reach of Caladan's soft rains, the wheels of a great and dangerous machine had already begun to turn, carrying toward this peaceful house a gift so large and so shining that no one could possibly refuse it, and so heavy with hidden intent that it would change every life beneath that ancient roof. For the moment, though, let the castle stand warm against the night. Let the fires burn low and the music fade, and the family sleep in the safety of the only home they had ever known. The change was coming, but it had not yet come, and there is grace in holding a house at its height for one long, quiet breath before the world begins to move. Up next in Chapter 2, The Gift That Was a Trap, will follow the arrival of the Emperor's great offer, the fief of Arrakis and its priceless spice, and feel the danger folded so carefully inside the honor. The gift came, as such things always do, wrapped in the language of honor. Word arrived at Caladan through the formal channels of the Imperium, born under the seal of the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV himself, and its substance was this. The Emperor, in his wisdom and his favor, had chosen to grant House Atreides the fief of Arrakis, the desert world also called Dune, the one planet in all the known universe where the spice melange was found. It was, on its shining surface, the greatest reward that could be offered to any noble house in the Empire, and the whole of the Landsraad understood it as such. Tonight, we sit with that gift, and we learn to see the shape of the trap folded so patiently inside it. To understand the weight of the offer, one must understand the spice. Melange was not merely valuable. It was the single most precious substance in the whole of human affairs, and everything that held the Empire together depended upon it. The spice extended life and sharpened health. It deepened awareness and awakened, in certain minds, the strange gift of prescience. Above all, it made possible the folding of space itself, for the navigators of the Spacing Guild consumed melange in great quantities and used the vision it gave them to steer their vast ships safely across the immense dark between the stars. Without the spice, there could be no travel between worlds, no trade, no empire at all. And the spice existed in only one place in all the universe, upon the burning sands of Arrakis. To hold Arrakis, therefore, was to hold a hand upon the throat of the entire human race. It was wealth beyond counting and power beyond measure, and the Emperor had just offered it to Duke Leto. Yet no gift so enormous is ever given freely, and every soul in the Atreides household, from the highest to the least, felt the wrongness of it beneath the glitter. Leto himself understood at once that he was being moved like a piece upon a board he could not fully see. For 80 years the fief of Arrakis had been held by House Harkonnen, the ancient and bitter enemies of the Atreides, a house grown vast and cruel and rich upon the labor of the desert. The Harkonnens had squeezed Arrakis for generations, taking its spice and giving nothing back, ruling through terror and giving no thought to the suffering of the people beneath them. That such a house should surrender such a prize, quietly and without a war, made no sense at all unless the surrender was itself a weapon. Thufir Hawat, the old Mentat, laid the logic bare in the cold, clean way that only a Mentat could. He reasoned through the tangle of it and arrived at a conclusion that chilled the room. The Emperor feared House Atreides. He feared the loyalty Leto commanded, feared the discipline of the Atreides fighting men, feared the growing admiration of the other great houses for a duke who ruled with justice rather than fear. A house that is admired becomes, in time, a house that others might follow. And an emperor who sits upon a throne built of careful balances cannot allow any single house to grow beloved beyond a certain point. And so, Hawat reasoned, this gift was not a reward at all. It was a summons to a killing ground. Arrakis would draw the Atreides out from the safety of their ancestral world, strip them of the seas and the loyal populace that made Caladan a fortress, and set them down alone upon an unfamiliar desert where their old enemies knew every dune and every hidden way. Somewhere in the machinery of the thing, Hawat was certain, the Harkonnens waited, and behind the Harkonnens, unseen and unproven, something colder still. Leto listened to all of this with the grave calm that never left him, and he did not argue against the reasoning, for he shared it. He understood that to accept the gift was to walk knowingly toward a trap, yet he also understood that to refuse it was impossible. One did not decline a direct grant from the Padishah Emperor without declaring oneself in rebellion against the throne, and such a declaration would bring the full weight of the Empire down upon Caladan at once. There was no path that led away from Arrakis. There was only the choice of how to walk toward it, and Leto resolved that he would walk toward it with his eyes open, taking every precaution, gathering every advantage, so that if the trap were sprung, it might yet be survived. But Leto saw something more than danger in the desert world, and this was the quiet genius of the man. Where his enemies saw only a killing ground, he saw also an opportunity that no Harkonnen had ever bothered to imagine. Arrakis held more than spice. It held a people. The Fremen, the free tribes of the deep desert, were spoken of in the Empire only as savages and raiders, uncounted and unimportant, dwellers in the wasteland beyond the reach of any census. But Leto, studying the reports that Hawat gathered, began to suspect that these dismissed and underestimated people might be the truest treasure of the planet. A folk who had survived for thousands of years in the harshest environment known to humankind, who had learned to wring water from the very air and to move unseen across a landscape that killed the unwary in hours, might make, if they could be won as friends, a force of fighters unlike any in the universe. This became Leto's private hope and his long design. He would go to Arrakis, not as the Harkonnens had gone, to plunder and to crush, but to earn the trust of the desert and to bind its people to his house in genuine friendship. It was a dream that would take patience beyond measure, and it began in these early days as little more than a resolve in the Duke's quiet heart. And so the household turned its full attention to the enormous labor of moving a great house from one world to another. Thufir Hawat set his agents to sifting Arrakis for hidden dangers and secret allies alike. Gurney Halleck drilled the fighting men in the ways of desert war, teaching them how a shield behaves in sand and how the great worms are drawn by rhythmic sound. Duncan Idaho was sent ahead into the deep desert itself to make the first cautious contact with the Fremen and to carry to them the goodwill of the Duke who was coming. Dr. Yue prepared his medicines for the dry heat and the endless thirst of the new world, and the Lady Jessica moved through it all with a heart grown quietly heavy, for she of all of them, with her Bene Gesserit sight, felt most keenly the danger gathering around the ones she loved. Young Paul, meanwhile, studied everything he could find about the world that was to become his home. He learned the names of its winds and the habits of its worms, the discipline of its water and the mystery of its spice. And as he learned, the dreams that had visited him on Caladan grew sharper and more insistent. The sand in his sleeping visions was the sand of Arrakis. The caverns of stone were the sea etches of the Fremen. And the girl with eyes the color of deep water was waiting for him somewhere out among those dunes, though he did not yet know her name. So the trap was set, and the Atreides walked toward it with open eyes and quiet courage, carrying with them not only their weapons and their fear, but also a hope that their enemies had never thought to guard against. The great ships of the Guild gathered above Caladan. The last rains fell upon the gray seas, and a whole household prepared to leave forever the only home it had ever known, bound for a desert that meant to be its grave, and might yet, against every design, become its greatest triumph. Up next in Chapter 3, The Move to Dune, we'll arrive with the household at Arrakeen, walk the halls of the great fortress, and meet the harsh and shining beauty of the desert world. The great ship of the Spacing Guild folded the vast distance between the stars in a span of time too small to feel, and when it opened again upon the light of a new sun, House Atreides had come to Dune. Tonight we come down out of the dark with them, drifting slowly toward the surface of the desert world, watching it grow beneath us from a small ochre coin into a whole planet of sand and stone and burning sky. There were no gray seas here, no soft rain, no green shores. There was only the desert, endless and patient, rolling away to every horizon in dunes the color of old gold, and above it a sky bleached pale by a sun that gave no mercy. The household came down at Arrakis, the chief city of the planet, and the seat from which the fief would be ruled. It was a walled city crouched at the foot of the great northern shield wall, a barrier of dark rock that stood between the settled lands and the deep desert beyond. At the heart of the city rose the Residency, the ancient fortress that would become the new home of the Atreides. It was an enormous structure of stone, built long ago and built to endure, its walls thick against the heat, its windows narrow against the blowing sand. Compared to the gentle castle of Caladan, it seemed a grim and heavy place, and yet there was a strength in it that Leto respected at once, for it had been raised by people who understood that on Arrakis survival itself was the first labor of every day. The Lady Jessica walked its halls in those first hours and felt the weight of the water discipline settle upon her. On Caladan, water had been so plentiful that no one thought of it at all. Here, water was life itself, measured and counted and never wasted, and the great fortress had been built with cisterns and moisture seals and 100 small mercies against the thirst of the desert. She found, in a conservatory hidden deep within the Residency, a garden of green plants kept alive by a fortune in water, left behind by some former lady of the house, and the sight of that green, in the midst of so much dryness, moved her strangely, half a comfort and half a warning of how far they had come from home. Everywhere she went, Jessica read the mood of the servants who had stayed on from the old order, and she began the patient work of learning which of them might be trusted and which might carry the poison of the Harkonnens in their hearts. Paul, for his part, felt the world close around him like the answer to a long question. The dreams that had followed him across the years had been dreams of exactly this place, and to stand at last upon the real sand, to breathe the real dry air with its faint cinnamon smell of spice, was to feel prophecy and reality fold quietly into one. He learned in those first days to wear the still suit, the marvelous garment of the desert folk that captured the water of the body, the sweat and the breath and every other moisture, and reclaimed it drop by precious drop, so that a person might walk for days across the open sand and drink from his own body's careful thrift. He learned to walk without rhythm across the open dunes, in the broken, irregular pace of the desert people, so that the great worms far below would not hear the steady drumbeat of ordinary footsteps and come to investigate. For the worms were the true masters of Arrakis, and no one who came to that world could forget them for long. They were creatures of impossible size, great living leviathans that swam through the deep sand as fish swim through water, drawn to any steady vibration upon the surface, able to swallow a spice harvester whole and leave no trace behind. The Fremen called them by an old and reverent name, and they were bound up in every part of desert life, feared and worshipped in the same breath. And it was the worms, in some way not yet understood by the men of the Empire, that stood at the very root of the spice itself, so that the most precious substance in all the universe and the most terrible predator upon that single world were tied together in a mystery that no outsider had ever solved. Leto set himself at once to the double labor that would fill his days, the labor of the spice and the labor of the people. The spice had to be harvested, for the whole empire watched to see whether the Atreides could keep the melange flowing, and any failure would be seized upon by his enemies as proof that the house had been unworthy of the gift. But the harvesting was slow and dangerous, and the Harkonnens, in their long spite, had stripped away much of the equipment when they departed, leaving behind old and failing machines that broke down in the heat and were forever threatened by the coming of the worms. Leto pressed forward regardless, riding out himself to watch the harvesters at their work, and in doing so, he showed the people of Arrakis a thing they had never seen from a ruler before: a duke who valued the lives of his workers above the flow of the spice, who would call his men back from a rich field rather than lose them to an approaching worm. That single act, witnessed and repeated in the retelling, began to do what all of Leto's careful planning could not do by itself. It began to reach the Fremen. Out in the deep desert, where the free tribes watched everything and trusted almost nothing, word passed from Sietch to Sietch that the new duke was a man who counted the water of his people as more precious than the wealth of the sand. To a folk who measured a person's worth by exactly such things, this was no small matter. Duncan Idaho, living now among the desert people as the duke's envoy, carried back to Arrakis the first careful signs of their regard. And out of the desert there came to the residency a man named Stilgar, a leader of the Fremen, hard and lean and dignified, who studied the duke with the flat measuring gaze of the desert and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not dislike what he saw. The wisest voice of the planet came to the Atreides as well, in the person of Dr. Liet Kynes, the imperial planetologist, the man who knew Arrakis more deeply than any other living soul. Kynes had been sent to judge the new rulers on behalf of the throne, and he came prepared to find them as careless and cruel as every ruler before them. Instead, he found a duke who asked him searching questions about the ecology of the desert, about water and wind and the slow turning of the sand, and who listened to the answers with real hunger. And Kynes, who carried in his own heart a secret and enormous dream for the future of Arrakis, began to wonder whether this house might be different from all the others, whether here at last was a power that might be turned toward the long green hope he had never dared to speak aloud. So the Atreides settled into the desert world, learning its harsh lessons day by day, harvesting its spice and slowly, patiently, earning the first fragile trust of its people. The danger had not passed. Thufir Hawat still smelled the trap in every corner, and the shadow of the Harkonnens still lay heavy over everything. But for a little while there was a fragile hopefulness in the great fortress, a sense of a house finding its feet upon strange ground, and beneath the pitiless sun of Arrakis, the small green shoots of Leto's long dream began, ever so quietly, to grow. Up next, in Chapter 4, The Betrayal That Failed. We'll come at last to the hidden Harkonnen plot and see the trap sprung upon the house and held. Every trap has a hidden hinge, one small secret upon which the whole cruel machine depends, and the trap laid for House Atreides was no different. Tonight we come to that hinge, and we watch it turn, and we learn how a betrayal so carefully built across so many years came in the end to fail. For this is the night the story changes, the night that all the darker histories were meant to begin and did not. The secret lay within the household itself, in the one man no one thought to doubt. Dr. Wellington Yueh bore upon his forehead the diamond tattoo of the Suk school, the mark of a conditioning so deep that it was held throughout the empire to be beyond breaking. A Suk doctor could not harm a patient placed in his care. This was known and trusted as a law of nature, and it was for exactly this reason that the Harkonnens had chosen him. For the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, that vast and calculating enemy of the Atreides, had done the thing that no one believed could be done. He had taken Yueh's beloved wife, a Bene Gesserit woman named Wana, and he had held her, and he had used the doctor's love for her and his terror for her suffering to twist the unbreakable conditioning against itself. The Baron had promised Yueh that if the doctor betrayed his duke, his wife would be freed from her torment. It was a lie, for the Baron intended her death regardless. But it was a lie built so cunningly upon a good man's love that it had very nearly worked. The plan had been simple in its cruelty. On a chosen night, Yueh was to lower the great house shields that protected Arrakis, disabling the electronic barriers that turned aside blades and blasts alike. With the shields down, a Harkonnen force, secretly reinforced by the Emperor's own dreaded soldiers disguised in Harkonnen colors, would fall upon the sleeping city and destroy the Atreides utterly. The Duke would be taken, his men would be slaughtered, his woman and his son would be cast out into the desert to die. And the whole thing would be done so swiftly and so completely that the Landsraad would wake to find House Atreides simply gone, erased. A lesson written in blood for any other house that dared to grow too beloved. But the trap had been built by people who understood cruelty far better than they understood loyalty, and it was loyalty, in the end, that broke it. For all his cold logic, Thufir Hawat had never stopped hunting for the hidden flaw, and in the last days before the appointed night, his agents brought him a thread he could not ignore. A whisper of a captured Bene Gesserit woman. A fragment of a coded message. A pattern in the doctor's sleepless grief that a lesser watcher would have dismissed as simple worry. Hawat did not dismiss it. He followed the thread with the patience of a mentat, and slowly, terribly, the shape of the impossible became clear to him. The betrayer was Yue. The conditioning had been broken, and the shields were the hinge upon which everything turned. There was no time to spare, and no room for error. Hawat brought the truth to the Duke in the deep hours of the night, and Leto, to his lasting credit, did not waste a single breath on rage or disbelief. He had always known a trap was coming. He had merely not known its shape, and now that he knew it, he moved. And here the true mercy of the changed story revealed itself. For Leto, being the man he was, chose not to strike Yue down. He went to the doctor instead, and he did not curse him, and he did not threaten him. He spoke to him quietly of his wife, and of loyalty, and of the difference between a house that ruled through fear and a house that had earned, even from a broken and desperate man, some last flicker of shame. And Yue, who had carried his terrible secret like a stone crushing the life from him, who had never truly wished to harm the one just master he had ever served, wept and turned. He gave up the whole of the plot, every hour and every hidden soldier, and he did not lower the shields. So the trap was sprung upon a household that was waiting for it. When the Harkonnen force came out of the night, expecting a sleeping and defenseless city, they found instead the great shields humming and whole, the gates sealed, the Atreides fighting men awake and armed and positioned exactly where they needed to be. Gurney Halleck met the attackers at the walls with the desert-hardened troops he had drilled so patiently, and the assault that was meant to be a slaughter became instead a battle, and the battle against every design of the Baron began to turn. Duncan Idaho fought his way through the confusion with the Fremen at his side, for Stilgar and his people, having taken the measure of the just Duke, had chosen in the crucial hour to stand with him, and the disguised soldiers of the Emperor, so confident of an easy victory, found themselves broken upon the shields and the courage of a house that refused to fall. Through the long hours of that night, the battle swayed back and forth across the walls and the courtyards of Arrakis, and more than once it seemed it might yet slip toward disaster. For the attackers were many and desperate, and had staked everything upon this single blow. But the Atreides had two gifts their enemies had not counted upon: warning and loyalty, and these two gifts together proved heavier than numbers. Where the attackers fought for a paymaster, the defenders fought for a man they loved, and that difference told in every corridor and upon every rampart as the night wore on toward its end. By the pale light of the desert morning, it was over. The attack had shattered against the readiness of the Atreides, and the Harkonnen force, what remained of it, fled back into the wastes or died upon the sand of Arrakis. House Atreides had been bloodied. Good men had fallen in the night, and the household would grieve them in the days to come. But the house stood, the Duke lived, The shields had held, and the trap that was meant to erase the Atreides from the memory of the Empire had instead announced to the whole of the Landsraad that here was a house that could not be so easily destroyed. For Ewa, there was a gentler reckoning than he had earned, and a heavier grief than he could bear. He learned, in the aftermath, what he had half suspected all along, that his beloved wife was already lost, that the Baron's promise had been poisoned from the first. Yet because he had turned in the end, because he had chosen at the last to keep faith with the Duke who had shown him mercy, Leto did not take his life. He kept him instead under close and quiet guard, a broken man permitted to live with the small redemption of the choice he had finally made. And this, too, was a thing that marked the changed story, for in the harder histories there had been no mercy anywhere in that night at all. And so, the great betrayal, planned across years and paid for in a wife's suffering and a good man's ruin, came to nothing. The hinge had turned the wrong way. The Baron, waiting in his orbiting ship for word of his triumph, received instead the impossible news that the Atreides yet lived, that the shields had held, that his masterpiece of treachery had broken upon the one thing he had never bothered to reckon with: the loyalty a just ruler earns from those around him. Somewhere in the cold reaches above Arrakis, a monstrous rage began to gather. But upon the surface, in the fortress of Arrakis, a wounded and weary house drew its first free breath of the morning, and Duke Leto the Just, who in another telling of this tale would have died upon this very night, stood living in the light of the desert sun. Up next in Chapter 5, A Duke Who Lived will rest in the quiet after the storm, and see what it means for a house and a world that the Duke endured where once he fell. Chapter 5, A Duke Who Lived. In the hours after the trap had failed, a strange and gentle quiet settled over the great fortress of Arrakis. The night that had been meant to end House Atreides forever was instead giving way, slowly, to a pale desert dawn, and the man who was supposed to have died was still alive. Duke Leto Atreides stood at a high window of the residency, weary beyond words yet unbroken, and watched the first light spill across the rooftops of the city. He had been struck down in another shape of the future, in a darker telling of these same events, but here, in this telling, the poison had not reached him, and the traitor's plan had come apart in the hands of those who said it. For the treachery had turned upon itself. Dr. Wellington Yueh, bound by a Suk conditioning that all the Imperium had believed unbreakable, had indeed been broken by the Baron's cruelty, made to lower the house shields and to leave the Duke defenseless. Yet the doctor, cornered between his loyalty and his ruined heart, had found in the last hour a sliver of will that no one had expected. He had warned Thufir Hawat in time. He had left, hidden in the collar meant for the Duke, not a killing gas, but a small mercy and a means of escape, and he had confessed the whole of the scheme before the poison could do its work. Because of that thin thread of conscience, the Atreides men had known the shape of the danger before it closed around them, and knowing a trap is half the way to surviving it. So the shields had held after all. The generators that Yueh was to have silenced kept their steady hum through the worst of the night, and the Sardaukar who came dressed in Harkonnen colors found not a sleeping house, but a house awake and armed and waiting. Duncan Idaho, who in another dawn had fallen covering the retreat of a boy and his mother, fought now beside living comrades and lived to see the morning. Gurney Halleck, who had been scattered far from his Duke in that other telling, held the lower halls with a band of Atreides veterans and turned back rush after rush. And Thufir Hawat, the old Mentat, whose calculations had been poisoned by doubt, watched his warnings prove true and felt, for once, the bitter comfort of having been believed in time. The battle had been terrible, all the same. No house survives such a night without loss, and the Duke did not pretend otherwise. Good men had died in the corridors and on the walls, and the residency bore the scars of fire and blade in 100 places. Yet when the sun rose full over Arrakis, the banner of the Red Hawk still flew above the fortress, and the Sardaukar assault, unable to break a prepared and stubborn defense before the desert daylight, and the watching eyes of the wider Imperium made their secrecy impossible, had drawn back into the dark from which it came. The Baron, who had promised the Emperor a swift and silent extermination, found himself instead with a bloodied nose and a house that would not fall. Leto understood, standing at that window, exactly how narrow the margin had been. He was a practical man, and he did not mistake survival for triumph. He knew that the same forces which had reached for his throat this night would reach again, and that the Emperor Shaddam IV, who had lent his own dread legions to the murder, could not be seen to have failed and would not easily forgive a duke who had lived to know it. There would be reckonings, and there would be patience, long games played across years. But those were troubles for the days ahead. On this morning, the only truth that mattered was the simplest one. He had lived. His son had lived. The Lady Jessica had lived. And the house that bore his name still stood upon the sands of Arrakis. He thought of Yue then, with a grief too complicated for anger. The doctor had betrayed him and had also, in the same breath, saved him, and both of those things were true at once. Whatever justice the future held for such a man was tangled past easy judgment, and Leto, who had learned long ago that a ruler must weigh mercy against duty, chose for now to set the question aside and simply to be grateful that a broken man had found one unbroken corner of himself. Below him the city was stirring. Water carriers moved along the shaded streets, and the smell of spice hung faint and cinnamon sweet on the cooling air, as it always did on this world, in every well and every meal and every breath. The people of Arrakis had heard the fighting in the night and had drawn their shutters and waited, as the poor and the powerless always wait, to learn which master would rule them in the morning. Now they were beginning to understand that the off-world Duke, the one they had watched with cautious eyes since his coming, had held his ground. Word travels quickly in a thirsty city. A ruler who could not be killed so easily was a ruler worth watching more closely, and perhaps, in time, worth trusting. Jessica came to stand beside him at the window, and though no words passed between them, the whole weight of the night rested in the space they shared. She was Bene Gesserit, trained to read the smallest shift in a face and to school her own past reading, yet even she had felt the fear of lost press close in the darkness, and even she was glad past discipline to see the sun rise on a living house. Somewhere in the residency their son slept at last, the boy Paul, who had been tested by a reverend mother and found strange, who dreamed dreams that were more than dreams, and who would grow now in the shelter of a father's continued life rather than in the hard school of exile and vengeance. That difference, though neither of them could yet measure it, would shape everything that followed. The Duke let his gaze travel out beyond the last walls of the city to where the streets gave way to broken rock and then to open sand, the great bled of the deep desert stretching south and east toward the pole. Out there, in the folds of the dunes, lived the people the Imperium counted as savages and phantoms. The Fremen, who moved like water through the driest land in the known universe, and whom no conqueror had ever truly ruled. Leto had come to Arrakis with a private hope, kept close and spoken to few, that he might win the friendship of the desert folk, where the Harkonnens had won only their hatred. In the ruin of the plot against him, that hope had not died. If anything, having survived the worst that his enemies could do, He saw more clearly than ever that the strength he needed was not to be found in the halls of the Landsraad or the favor of a treacherous emperor. It was out there, in the sand, among the blue within blue eyes of a hardy and secret people. He did not know yet how that friendship would be made, or what it would cost, or how far it would carry his house into a future no one had foreseen. He knew only that he had been given something rare and precious, a second morning, a life continued past the hour of its intended ending, and that a wise man does not waste such a gift. The desert waited, his house endured, and Duke Leto Atreides, the just man who had lived where he was meant to die, turned from the window at last to begin the long work of building a peace out of the ashes of a war. Up next in Chapter 6, The Desert Alliance, we'll follow the Duke's long dream of joining his house to the power of the sands, and the meeting of Leto and Stilgar that would bind the Atreides and the Fremen together. Chapter 6. The Desert Alliance. Long before he ever set foot upon Arrakis, Duke Leto Atreides had carried a quiet dream within him, folded away beneath the daily cares of governing and the hard business of survival. It was a dream of desert power. He had studied the reports that reached Caladan across the years, the thin and grudging records that the Harkonnens kept of the people they could neither count nor conquer. And where others saw only a nuisance in the sand, Leto saw something rarer. He saw a nation. He saw men and women bred by the harshest world in the Imperium into a hardiness and a discipline that no formal army could match. And he understood, as few great lords ever troubled to understand, that whoever befriended such a people would hold in his hand a strength beyond the reach of spice or gold. Now, with the trap sprung and survived, and his house still standing upon the sands, that dream ceased to be a private hope and became a plain necessity. Leto knew that he could not lean upon the Emperor, who had lent his Sardaukar to the murder. He knew that the Landsraad admired a strong house, but rescued no weak one, and that the Spacing Guild cared only for the flow of spice, and would carry his enemies as readily as his friends. If House Atreides was to endure on Arrakis, it would endure by winning the one power that truly belonged to this world, and to no other. It would endure by winning the Fremen. The first steps had already been taken. Quietly, in the days before the assault, Dr. Liet Kynes, the planetologist who served the Emperor in name but the desert in his heart, had watched the newcomers with a careful and skeptical eye. He had expected another Harkonnen in a different coat, another off-world lord who would strip the spice and spend the people and give nothing back to the sand. Instead, he had seen a duke who asked after the Fremen not as vermin to be culled, but as subjects to be respected. A duke who spoke of desert power with something like reverence, and who ordered his men to spare Fremen lives where the old regime had spent them freely. Kynes was not a man easily moved, but he was a man who had waited his whole life for a great lord who might share the desert's own long dream. In Leto he began, cautiously, to see one. It was Kynes, in the end, who opened the door. In the aftermath of the failed betrayal, when the Duke's survival had already begun to change the calculations of every power on the planet, the planetologist arranged a meeting that no Harkonnen had ever earned, and no Atreides could have demanded. He brought the Duke, under careful conditions and deep secrecy, to speak with the leaders of the desert, and chief among them was a Naib named Stilgar, the stern and canny leader of a Sietch in the deep south, a man whose loyalty could not be bought, and whose respect could not be feigned. Stilgar came to that meeting expecting little and prepared for treachery. He had buried too many of his people beneath Harkonnen cruelty to trust any face from beyond the sand. Yet, what he found was not the arrogance he had braced against. He found a lord who knew the value of water in a way that no soft off-worlder should, who understood that on Arrakis a man's moisture was his life, and that to waste it was a kind of murder. He found a duke who did not flinch at the customs of the desert, who honored the courtesies of the sietch, and who offered not the false generosity of a conqueror handing down favors, but the plain proposal of a partnership between equals. Leto did not come to rule the Fremen. He came to stand beside them. The bargain that grew between them was not struck in a single night, for neither man was a fool, and trust between peoples so long divided is built slowly, stone upon stone. But the foundation was laid in that first meeting, and it was a strong one. The Duke offered what the Fremen had never been given by any off-world power. He offered protection under his name, a shield of law and arms against the Harkonnens who had hunted them for generations. He offered training in the fighting arts of the wider Imperium, the discipline of the Atreides war masters set beside the desert's own fierce craft. And most precious of all, he offered respect, a public and unfeigned acknowledgement that the people of the sand were a people and not a plague. In return, the Fremen offered the Duke the thing that no coin could purchase. They offered the desert itself. They offered knowledge of the deep bled where no off-world army could follow, mastery of the sandworms that ruled the open dunes, the arts of survival in a land that killed the unwary within hours. They offered numbers greater than any census had ever guessed, a hidden nation woven through the caves and cliffs of the southern latitudes. And they offered, in time, their loyalty, which once given was given past death, for the Fremen did not scatter their trust and did not take it back once it was placed. Duncan Idaho, who had lived through the night of the assault, became one of the first bridges between the two worlds. He went among the Fremen as the Duke's man and learned their ways with an open heart, and they, sensing in him no falseness, took him in as few outsiders were ever taken. Where in a darker telling he had died young, here he lived to walk between sietch and fortress, carrying word and building the thousand small understandings out of which a true alliance is made. Thufir Hawat, ever the cautious Mentat, watched it all and calculated and slowly allowed himself to believe that his Duke had found something no ledger could measure, a well of strength that would not run dry. There were doubts on both sides, and honest ones. Some among the Fremen remembered too many broken promises to give their faith easily, and they watched the Atreides for the first sign of the old greed. Some among the Duke's own men wondered whether their lord had chosen well in tying his fortunes to a people the Imperium counted as ghosts. But Leto held to his course with the steady patience that was his nature, and time answered the doubters. The Atreides kept their word. They spent no Fremen life carelessly. They honored the water rights. They did not try to make the desert folk into something they were not. And the Fremen, watching, began at last to lower their guard. So, the alliance took root, quietly, in the folds of the dunes and the shaded halls of the fortress, an alliance such as Arrakis had never known. It bound the honor and the arms of a great house to the hidden strength of the desert, and it changed the balance of power on that world, in a way that neither the Baron in his fortress nor the Emperor on his distant throne had reckoned upon. A Duke and a Naib had clasped hands across the widest gulf in the Imperium, and out of that clasp a new thing was being born, a partnership of sand and sea, of the ocean world and the desert world, that would carry House Atreides into a future no prophecy had prepared. And at the center of it all, a boy was watching and learning, a boy who would grow up not in exile among strangers, but openly among the desert people, with his father alive beside him to guide his steps into the sand. Up next, in Chapter 7, Paul among the Fremen openly. We'll follow young Paul as he is raised into the ways of the desert, learning the sietch and the water discipline and the worm. without exile and without loss. Chapter 7. Paul among the Fremen openly. Of all the many gifts that came to House Atreides in the years after the trap had failed, perhaps none was gentler than this one. Paul, the Duke's son, grew into the ways of the desert, not as a fugitive and not as an orphan, but openly, in the light of day, with his father living and his mother whole and the strength of his house behind him. In another and darker telling of these events, the boy had been thrown into the sand by grief, his father slain, his home lost, his childhood ended in a single terrible night. Here he was given the far kinder path. He learned the desert the way a beloved son learns the trade of his father, slowly and with joy, one lesson at a time, and no shadow of vengeance drove his steps. The Fremen, who had taken the measure of the Duke and found him worthy, took the measure of his son and found him remarkable. They saw a boy of unusual stillness, quick of eye and quiet of manner, who watched everything and boasted of nothing. They saw a youth who did not carry the soft helplessness they expected of off-world nobility, but who could go without water past the point where most children would weep, who learned their tongue and their signs with an ease that unsettled the old women, and who moved across the dunes as though some part of him had always belonged there. There were those among the desert people who began, very early, to whisper old prophecies when they watched him walk, though the Duke and the Lady Jessica did their careful best to let the boy simply be a boy. Stilgar took a special interest in Paul, as a stern man sometimes takes a special interest in a promising youth who reminds him of what he himself might have been. Under the Neeb's watchful eye, and with the blessing of the Duke, Paul was permitted to spend long stretches in the Sietch, living among the Fremen children and the Fremen elders, sharing their labor and their meals and their harsh and beautiful discipline. He learned the water rites, the sacred arithmetic of moisture by which the desert people measured every drop against the coming of the green world they dreamed of. He learned that, in a stillsuit, worn correctly and honored as a second skin, a man might walk the open sand for days and lose only a thimbleful of himself to the thirsty air. He learned to sip and never to waste, to reclaim, to reckon his own body as a vessel of precious water held in trust. He learned the Sietch itself, that hidden world within the world, the caves cut deep into the rock where whole communities lived unseen by any off-world eye. He came to know the smell of it, spice and smoke and close-packed life, the murmur of voices in the shaded dark, the pool rooms where the guarded treasure of the tribe, its stored water, was kept against the day of the great changing. He learned the discipline that held such a people together, the fierce courtesy, the laws of hospitality and challenge, the way a community pressed hard against a killing world grows both harder and closer than any softer nation ever could. And because his father lived and his house prospered, Paul learned all of this without the desperation of survival, as a student and a guest, and more, as a friend. Above all, he learned the worm. The great makers of Arrakis, the sandworms that ruled the open desert and through some deep mystery gave rise to the spice itself, were to the Fremen both terror and sacrament. Paul watched from safe distances at first, as the desert people read the sand for the signs of a worm's coming. The drum of movement felt through the soles of the feet, the ripple far off across the dunes. He learned the rhythm of walking without rhythm, the broken irregular gait that did not call the maker up from the deep. He learned the reverence with which the Fremen spoke of the worms, whom they named among their holy things, and he felt the awe of a boy standing at the edge of something vast and ancient and utterly beyond the tame world of Caladan from which his family had come. The riding of the worms, that most daring of all the desert arts, was not given to him early, for it was a right reserved and dangerous, and the Duke would not have his only son spent recklessly. But Paul watched the Sandriders go out with their hooks and their goads, and he understood that this too lay somewhere in his future, and he waited for it with the patience his father had taught him. In another telling, he had come to that right as a hunted exile, proving himself to strangers. Here he would come to it, when the time was right, as a welcomed son of an allied house, with no one's death upon the scales. His mother watched all of this with the complicated heart of a Bene Gesserit and the simple heart of a mother, and the two did not always agree. Jessica knew, better than anyone, the strange currents that ran in her son. She had borne him against the designs of her order, she had trained him herself in the subtle arts of the sisterhood, and she had felt, growing year by year, the pressure of something waking in him that no ordinary boy possessed. Yet here, in the shelter of a living house, she could let that waking come slowly. There was no crucible of grief forcing his gifts open before their time, no desperate flight into the deep desert with the whole weight of survival pressing his mind past its natural pace. Paul could grow into himself as a garden grows, season by season, and Jessica, watching him laugh with the Fremen children and return sunburned and content from the dunes, allowed herself to hope that gentleness might be enough. The Duke, for his part, took a plain and unguarded joy in his son that the cares of rule had never quite allowed him on Caladan. Here, on Arrakis, with the great danger survived and the desert alliance taking root, Leto found hours he had never expected to have, hours to walk with Paul along the walls of the fortress at evening, to speak with him of governing and of honor, and of the long, slow work of keeping faith with a people. He taught the boy what he himself had learned across a hard life. That power rests in the end upon loyalty freely given, that a ruler who spends his people carelessly will find himself alone, that the desert of Arrakis, like the ocean of Caladan, would answer respect with strength and contempt with ruin. And Paul, who in another life had been robbed of these years, drank them in. So the son of the Duke grew up between two worlds and belonged, in a strange way, to both. He was an Atreides, heir to a great house of the Imperium, schooled in its statecraft and its ancient loyalties. And he was becoming, day by day, something of a Fremen too, at home in the Siege, trusted by the Naib, marked by the desert people as one who understood their ways and honored their water. It was a rare and precious thing, a childhood lived whole, and it would shape the man he was to become as surely as grief had shaped him in that other and sadder telling. The desert had taken him in, and it had not asked his sorrow as the price. Up next in Chapter 8, Spice Without Slaughter, will follow House Atreides as it comes to master the great melange trade of Arrakis, dealing with the Spacing Guild and loosening the Emperor's grip through justice rather than through blood. Chapter 8, Spice Without Slaughter. At the heart of everything on Arrakis lay the spice, the melange, the strange and precious substance that the whole of the known universe could not do without. It was found on this one world and no other, born somehow of the deep desert and its great worms, and it was worth more than any treasure ever mined or minted. The spice extended life. It sharpened the mind. It gave to the navigators of the Spacing Guild the prescient sight by which they folded space and carried the ships of the Imperium safely between the stars. Without it, commerce would halt, the great houses would wither, and the whole vast web of human civilization spun across 1,000 worlds would begin, slowly and terribly, to come apart. Whoever controlled the spice held a hand upon the throat of the universe, and the Emperor knew it, and the Guild knew it, and now House Atreides, having survived the trap laid to take Arrakis from it, held that fearful trust. Under the Harkonnens, the getting of spice had been a thing of blood. The old regime had driven its harvesters into the deep desert with no care for the men who worked them or the Fremen whose land they stripped. Spice had been torn from Arrakis the way a robber tears rings from a corpse, greedily and without honor. And the wealth of it had flowed off-world to feed the appetites of a cruel house, while the desert people were hunted and the workers were spent like water poured into the sand. The Baron had measured his success in tonnage and cared nothing for the cost. His was a harvest of slaughter, and the whole planet had groaned beneath it. Duke Leto set himself, from the first, to do the thing differently. He understood, as the Baron never had, that the spice would flow more surely from a world at peace than from a world in chains. Where the Harkonnens had made war upon the desert, the Atreides made friendship, and that friendship changed the whole nature of the harvest. The Fremen, who knew the deep bled as no off-world crew ever could, who could read the sign of a coming worm and the shift of a coming storm, became not the enemies of the spice trade, but its silent partners. With their knowledge, the harvesters could work the sand more safely, retreating before the makers and the great weather, with a warning no instrument could match. Fewer men and fewer machines were lost. The desert, no longer treated as a foe to be beaten, gave up its treasure with something closer to consent. So the spice flowed, and it flowed richly, and it flowed with far less death than it had ever cost before. This was the meaning of the phrase that the people of Arrakis began, in time, to speak of their new duke, that here at last was spice without slaughter. The wealth of the harvest, no longer bled away entirely to distant coffers, began to return in part to the world that bore it. Leto invested in the workers and their safety, in the equipment that spared lives, and quietly, through 100 careful channels, in the long desert dream of the Fremen themselves. The great melange trade became, under Atreides' hands, not a wound in the side of the planet, but a river of strength feeding a growing house. With wealth came the delicate business of the Spacing Guild. The guild cared nothing for the honor of houses or the fortunes of emperors. It cared for spice, upon which its navigators depended for their very sight, and it dealt with whoever could deliver it. The guild had watched the failed betrayal on Arrakis with its cold and patient attention, and it had noted, in its silent way, that the Atreides now held the harvest and held it well. A house that could keep the spice flowing was a house the guild would carry, and a house the guild would carry was a house that could not easily be isolated or destroyed. Leto, ever the careful statesman, cultivated that relationship with great subtlety, understanding that the guild's neutrality was itself a kind of protection, a shield woven of pure self-interest that no army could pierce. For the guild's dependence ran deeper than mere commerce, and Leto, with the counsel of his Mentat Tufir Hawat, came to grasp the full weight of the lever he now held. The whole of the Imperium turned upon the spice, and the spice turned upon Arrakis, and Arrakis was his. He did not brandish this power, for he was not a rash man, and he knew that a threat spoken aloud too soon is a weapon spent. But he understood it, and the understanding of it steadied him. The same emperor who had lent his Sardaukar to the murder of the Atreides could not lightly move against them again, for to threaten the house that held the spice was to threaten the flow of the spice itself, and that no power in the universe, not even the Padishah Emperor upon the Golden Lion throne, could truly afford. So the grip of the Emperor upon Arrakis began, quietly, to loosen. Shaddam IV had given the fief of Dune to House Atreides as a trap, meaning to see it broken there. Instead, the trap had failed, and the house he had sought to destroy now sat astride the single most vital resource in the Imperium, growing richer and stronger with every passing season. What had been meant to be the ruin of the Atreides was becoming, instead, the foundation of a strength that the throne itself would come in time to fear. The Emperor could rage in his distant palace on Kitane, but rage alone moves nothing, and the plain arithmetic of the spice bound his hands. To strike at Arrakis was to strike at himself. Leto gathered this power the way a wise farmer gathers a harvest, patiently and in season, and he used it with justice rather than with cruelty. He did not hoard the wealth of the spice into a mountain of dead gold. He spent it upon his people and his allies, upon the safety of his workers and the dreams of the Fremen, and the slow strengthening of his house against the storms he knew must come. He dealt fairly with the merchants and the factors of the Landsraad, and word of that fairness traveled, as such word always does, so that houses which had watched the newcomer with suspicion began to see in him a partner worth having. Wealth won by honor is wealth that makes friends, and House Atreides, which under the trap had nearly lost everything, found itself gathering allies where it had expected only enemies. There was a deeper wisdom in all of this, and Jessica saw it, and Hawat calculated it, and even young Paul, watching his father govern, began to understand it. Power taken by blood breeds only more blood, and the house that lives by slaughter dies by it in the end. But power gathered by justice puts down roots. The Fremen served the Atreides not from fear, but from trust. The workers labored for a house that valued their lives. The guild carried a house that kept its promises. Each of these bonds was a thread, and no single thread was unbreakable, but woven together across the years they made a fabric of strength that no sudden treachery could tear. The Baron had built his power upon terror, and terror is a house built upon sand. Leto was building his upon faith, and faith, patiently tended, endures, and so the spice flowed, and the house grew rich, and the desert gave up its treasure with less and less of death, and the grip of the throne loosened season by season. What the Harkonnens had wrung from Arrakis in blood, the Atreides drew from it in peace, and the world itself seemed to breathe easier beneath the change. A great house was learning that the surest power is the power freely granted, and it was gathering, quietly and justly, the strength it would need for all the long years still to come. Up next in Chapter 9, Jessica, Leto, and a house united will turn to the family at the heart of it all, whole and unbroken, and to the way the designs of the Bene Gesserit were forced to bend around a house that lived. Chapter 9. Jessica, Leto, and a house united. In the great fortress of Arrakis, when the worst of the danger had passed and the desert had settled into its long patient silence, there came a kind of quiet that the House of Atreides had not known in many years. It was not the quiet of exhaustion, though there had been exhaustion enough. It was the quiet of a family that had come through fire together and found itself, against every expectation, still whole. Duke Leto lived. Lady Jessica walked the halls without fear of who might be waiting in the shadows. And young Paul, no longer a boy in truth though still young in years, moved between them like a bridge that held two shores together. Tonight we drift into the gentleness of that house united, and we let the softness of it carry us towards sleep. Consider Jessica first, for her burden had always been the heaviest and the least seen. She was a daughter of the Bene Gesserit, trained from girlhood in the deep disciplines of the sisterhood, taught to read the smallest tremor of a muscle, to hear the untruth beneath a spoken word, to bend her own body and breath to her will. She had been sent to Leto, not as a bride, but as an instrument, a woman meant to bear a daughter for the long secret breeding of the sisterhood, a plan that reached across the centuries toward a being they called the Kwisatz Haderach. Yet Jessica had loved Leto, truly and against her orders, and out of that love she had given him a son instead of a daughter. In a harsher telling of this tale, that choice would have cost her everything. Here, In a house that did not fall, it cost her only the quiet ache of a secret carried well. For now, the danger that would have driven her into the desert as a fugitive had never come to pass. She was not a woman fleeing across the sand with her child, hunted, uncertain of the next dawn. She was the Lady Jessica of Arrakis, bound consort of a living duke, mistress of a great house upon a world that was slowly, carefully becoming her own. And so the sisterhood, watching from its distant chapter houses, found its careful designs bending around a house that would not break. The Bene Gesserit were patient beyond ordinary patience. They had woven bloodlines across 90 generations. They had planted their protective myths upon 100 worlds against the day one of their number might need shelter. But they had planned for a fall, and no fall had come, and so their long weaving had to find a new shape. They did not abandon their designs. They simply waited and watched and adjusted as they had always done. Jessica felt the change in herself before she could name it. The vigilance that had lived in her shoulders for so many years began, slowly, to loosen. She still trained. She still moved through the fighting forms in the gray hours before dawn, still practiced the weirding way that made her body a weapon more subtle than any blade. But she trained now as one keeps a garden, rather than as one sharpens for war. She began to give her attention to the running of the household, to the water stores and the servants and the delicate matters of a court that must present strength to the Landsrod even as it healed. And she gave her attention, most of all, to her son. All had grown strange to her, and she knew it, and she did not fear it. The spice was in everything on Arrakis, in the food, in the very air, and it had begun its slow work in him, opening doors in his mind that most human minds never approach. He had begun to see, not the ordinary seeing of eyes, but the terrible seeing of a consciousness that could feel the branching futures spreading out before it, like the many channels of a river reaching toward a delta. In the harsher tale, this awakening had come to him through grief and flight, through the death of his father and the loss of his home, a gift torn out of him by suffering. Here it came differently. It came slowly, in the safety of a living house, with his father beside him and his mother watching over him, and that difference would matter more than anyone yet understood. And Leto. The Duke had been a man shaped by duty since before he could remember, raised to command, taught that a ruler belongs to his people and not to himself. He had come to Arrakis expecting to die there, though he had never spoken the fear aloud, for he had read the trap folded inside the Emperor's gift as clearly as any of his counselors. He had prepared for treachery. He had guarded against it, and when the treachery came, the house had held, and now Leto found himself alive in a future he had not truly believed he would see. It changed a man, that survival. It did not make him careless, but it softened something in him that had been clenched for a very long time. In the evenings, when the twin work of governing and defending eased for an hour, the three of them would come together in the high rooms of the fortress, where the thick stone kept out the day's heat, and the windows looked across the rooftops of Arrakis toward the open desert beyond. Leto would speak with his son of the things a ruler must know, of the balance of the Landsrod, of the guild that held the monopoly of space, of the delicate arithmetic of the spice. Jessica would listen, and now and then she would add the thing that neither of them had seen, the reading of a face, the weight beneath a message from a distant house. They were not merely a family in those hours. They were a house thinking as one mind, 3 strands of a single cord, and a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. There was tenderness in it, too, the ordinary tenderness that great affairs so often crowd out. Leto and Jessica had never married, for the Duke had kept himself formally free for the sake of political alliances he might one day need to make. Yet, in every way that a heart measures, they belonged to each other, and in the safety of the enduring house that belonging could breathe, Jessica no longer had to weigh every gentleness against the fear of what the sisterhood might demand of her next. Leto no longer had to hold his tenderness in reserve against the day he might have to spend her hand upon a treaty. They had time. That was the great and simple gift of it. They had time to simply be a family, and time is the one thing the powerful almost never possess. And so the house settled into itself. The men of the Duke came and went, Gurney and Duncan and old Thufir, and each of them felt the change and was warmed by it, for they had served this family through danger and had earned this quieter season as much as any Atreides. The fortress that had once seemed a place of siege became, by slow degrees, a home. Beyond its walls the desert stretched vast and indifferent, the sandworms moving in their unseen deeps, the spice blooming on the wind. But within the walls there was a light in the evening windows, and 3 people who loved one another sitting together while the long day cooled. And the deep peace of that scene is a good thing to carry with us now toward rest. Up next, in Chapter 10, Gurney's music in a time of peace, we'll listen as the War Master sets down his blade and takes up his baliset, and feel the softer texture of a court that need not always be ready for war. Chapter 10. Gurney's music in a time of peace. Among all the men who served the House of Atreides, there was one who carried in himself the strange doubleness of the warrior who is also an artist, and his name was Gurney Halleck. Tonight, we let ourselves drift into the softer hours of the enduring house, and we listen, in imagination, to the sound of his baliset drifting through the stone corridors of Arrakis, a sound that belongs not to war, but to peace. Let the slow music of it carry you gently down towards sleep. Gurney had not always been a man of great houses. He had come up hard, from a world beneath the boot of the Harkonnens, and he wore the marks of that history upon his own body. Across his jaw there ran an ink-vine scar, a long dark line left by a Harkonnen overseer in the slave pits, a wound that had never fully faded and that he had chosen never to hide. He had lost a sister to the cruelty of that house. He had lost years of his youth to their pits and their casual violence. And out of all that suffering he had come, at last, into the service of the Atreides, and there he had found something he had not expected to find again, which was a lord worth loving and a cause worth the whole of his fierce loyalty. He was called the War Master, and he had earned the name. In battle he was terrible, swift and merciless, and utterly without hesitation, a man who had studied the killing arts until they were as natural to him as breathing. He had trained young Paul in the ways of the blade, pressing the boy hard, refusing him the comfort of easy victories. For Gurney understood that a soft training makes a soft warrior, and a soft warrior does not survive. He had fought at the Duke's side when the Harkonnen treachery broke against the walls of Arrakis, and he had given no ground, and when the smoke cleared he was among those still standing. Yet there was another Gurney, and this second man had always lived alongside the first. For Gurney Halleck loved music the way some men love wine or gold or glory. He carried a baliset with him wherever he went, a 9-stringed instrument, cousin to the ancient guitar, and he played it with a skill that would have made him welcome in any court in the Imperium had he chosen a different life. He wrote his own songs, and he sang the old ones. And his voice, rough and deep and marked by the same hard years that had marked his face, could turn from a marching tune to a lament so tender that grown soldiers would fall silent to hear it. In the hardest days, on the eve of battle, he had played to steady the men, and his music had been a kind of armor for the spirit. But there is a difference between music played to prepare for death and music played simply for the joy of it, and it was this second music that the enduring house now allowed. For in the harsher telling of this tale, Gurney was scattered from his lord, driven into the deep desert to live among smugglers, believing his duke dead and his young master lost. And he carried his balisette through those wilderness years like a relic of a world that had ended. His music in that time was the music of grief and of vengeance held close. Here, in the house that did not fall, it was another thing entirely. Here Gurney remained where he belonged, at the side of a living duke, in a house that still had need of his blade, but no longer had need of it every hour of every day. And so the War Master discovered a season he had scarcely dared to imagine, a time when the sword could rest against the wall and the balisette could be taken down from its place, when the songs need not be about the fallen, but could be about the living, about the desert dawn and the strange beauty of a world of sand, about the slow greening that the planetologists dreamed of, about ordinary things, love and weariness, and the way the stars looked over the open dunes. There were evenings in the fortress when the day's work was done, and the great household gathered in the lower halls, and Gurney would take his place in a corner with the balisette across his knee, and he would begin to play. He never made a great show of it. He would simply begin, softly, letting the first notes find their way into the room. And one by one, the talk would settle, and the listeners would turn toward the sound. He played the old ballads of Caledon, the ocean world that the Atreides had left behind, songs of green hills and gray seas and rain. And for the men and women who had followed their duke into the desert, those songs were a taste of the home they had given up, a homesickness made sweet by the melody. And then he would play something newer, something of Arrakis itself, for even a man who had suffered under the desert sun could learn to hear a music in it. The vast silence, the wind across the dunes, the terrible slow grandeur of the great worms moving unseen beneath the sand. Paul would sit and listen, and something in him that the spice was slowly opening would answer to the music in ways he could not always name. Jessica would listen with the trained ear of the Bene Gesserit, hearing beneath the melody the whole man who made it, the pain and the loyalty and the hard-won peace all woven together in the strings. And Leto, the Duke, would listen most of all, for he loved this rough-scarred man as a brother in arms, and knew what it had cost Gurney to reach a place where he could play for joy. To see his War Master at ease, to see the sword resting and the balisette singing, was to see with his own eyes the proof that his house had won something more than survival. It had won a measure of peace, and peace is the rarest treasure in the Imperium. There is a particular kindness in the sight of a hard man made gentle by his art. Gurney Halleck had killed more men than he could count. He had endured cruelties that would have broken a lesser spirit. He had every reason to be nothing but a blade, sharp and cold and turned always toward the next enemy. And yet within that same man there lived a maker of songs, a singer of laments and celebrations, a soul that reached toward beauty as naturally as his hand reached toward his weapon. In a house forever at war, that softer soul must always be crowded aside. In the house that endured, it was given room to breathe, and the whole court was gentler for it. So let us leave the War Master there, in the cool lower hall of the fortress of Arrakis, the balisette across his knee, the 9 strings warm beneath his fingers, the low song rising into the quiet while the desert night deepens beyond the walls. Let the imagined music soften and slow, note falling after note, like water in a still place, and let it draw us down toward our own rest, carrying with it the good knowledge that even the hardest of lives can find, at last, a season of gentleness. Up next in Chapter 11, The Harkonnen answered, "We'll turn to the long reckoning with the brutal house that sought the ruin of the Atreides, and see how that reckoning was settled on Atreides' terms and in Atreides' time." Chapter 11. The Harkonnen answered, "There is a kind of justice that comes swiftly, in a single stroke, and there is another kind that comes slowly, with patience, in its own chosen time. Tonight, we consider the second kind, the long and careful reckoning between the House of Atreides and the House of Harkonnen, two great families bound together across the centuries by an enmity so old that its beginnings had passed almost into legend. Let the slow unfolding of this reckoning carry you gently, for even matters of old hatred can be told softly, as a tale told at the edge of sleep. To understand the reckoning, one must first understand the enemy. The House of Harkonnen was ruled by the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, a man of vast appetites and vast cruelty, so heavy in his flesh that he could no longer bear his own weight and moved instead upon suspensors, small devices that held his great bulk floating above the ground. He was clever, terribly clever, a schemer who delighted in the long game and in the suffering of others, and he had nursed his hatred of the Atreides for the whole of his life. The two houses were ancient rivals, and more than rivals, for a Harkonnen had once fled a battle in a way that had shamed his line before all the great houses. And the Atreides had been there to see the shame, and that old wound had never healed. The Baron wanted more than the defeat of the Atreides. He wanted their annihilation, their name erased, their honor ground into the sand. It was the Baron who had arranged, with the Emperor's secret blessing, the whole elaborate trap of Arrakis. He had held the desert world before the Atreides came, and he knew its every secret, its hidden bases, its stores of weapons, its ways of moving unseen through the wastes. He had planted his agents within the Atreides household long before the move to Dune. He had bought, through terrible means, the treachery of one trusted man, and he had prepared to strike in the moment of the Atreides' greatest vulnerability, when they were newly arrived and not yet settled upon a world they did not understand. And in the harsher telling of this tale, the trap closed, and the great Duke fell, and the House of Atreides was scattered to the desert and thought destroyed, and the Baron laughed in his floating chair and believed himself the victor. But that is not the tale we are telling. In the house that endured, the trap was seen and turned and survived. The treachery was uncovered in time, or blunted, so that when the blow fell it did not find the throat it was aimed at. The Harkonnen forces broke against the walls of Arrakis and were thrown back into the desert. The Baron's certain victory became instead an uncertain and bloody stalemate, and then, as the seasons turned, something worse for him than a stalemate. It became a slow defeat. For the Atreides did not answer the Harkonnen in fury. That was the wisdom of the enduring house. A lesser lord, having survived such treachery, might have flung his whole strength at once against the Baron, hurling his soldiers into a reckless war of vengeance. Duke Leto did no such thing. He had studied his enemy across a lifetime, and he understood that the Baron was strongest when his enemies were rash, and weakest when they were patient. And so, Leto chose patience. He chose to answer the Harkonnen not in the Baron's chosen hour, but in his own. Not by the Baron's methods, but by the methods of a house that ruled by justice and by the loyalty it earned. The first weapon of that patient answer was the desert itself, and the people of the desert. For the Atreides had done the one thing the Harkonnen never could. They had won the friendship of the Fremen, the fierce hidden folk of the deep sand, whom the Harkonnen had for generations hunted and despised, and counted as little more than vermin. The Baron had never troubled to learn how many the Fremen truly were, nor how they moved, nor what they could do. He had underestimated them utterly, as cruel men so often underestimate those they scorn. And now, those same Fremen, bound in alliance with the living Duke, became a power that harried the Harkonnen at every turn, striking at their spice harvesters, vanishing into the wastes before any answer could be made, bleeding the Baron's operations slowly and steadily and without end. The second weapon was the spice itself. For whoever controlled the flow of the melange controlled a thing that the whole Imperium could not do without. The Guild needed it to fold space and move its great ships between the stars. The Bene Gesserit needed it for their deep disciplines. The rich and the powerful across 1,000 worlds needed it, craved it, could not live without it once they had begun. And the Atreides, holding Arrakis and allied with the Fremen who knew the desert as no Harkonnen ever had, came to hold the spice more firmly than the Baron had ever held it. Where the Harkonnen had wrung the melange from the sand by brute force and terror, the Atreides gathered it by knowledge and by partnership, and their harvest was the surer for it. Slowly the balance of the spice shifted, and with it the balance of wealth, and with wealth the balance of power. And so the reckoning came, not as a single battle, but as a long tightening, season upon season, in which the House of Harkonnen found itself steadily poorer, steadily weaker, steadily more isolated among the great houses, while the House of Atreides grew steadily stronger. The Baron, for all his cleverness, could find no way to break the pattern. Every stroke he attempted was foreseen or absorbed. Every agent he sent was turned or discovered. The desert swallowed his soldiers. The spice slipped from his grasp. And the great houses of the Landsraad, watching all of this, drew their own quiet conclusions about which family was rising and which was falling, and adjusted their friendships accordingly, as the powerful always do. There was a justice in this that was deeper than mere vengeance. The Atreides did not become the Harkonnen in order to defeat them. They did not answer cruelty with cruelty, nor treachery with treachery. They answered the Baron by being the thing he could never be. A house that ruled by trust rather than terror, that earned its power rather than seizing it, that bound others to itself by loyalty rather than by fear. And that, in the end, was the answer the Harkonnen could not counter. For it drew upon a strength the Baron did not possess and could not even understand. He had built his house upon fear, and fear is a foundation that crumbles the moment the fearful sense that their masters have grown weak. The full settling of accounts would take time, as all such things do, and we need not rush it here at the edge of sleep. It is enough tonight to know that the great enemy was answered, and answered well, and answered on the terms that the House of Atreides chose. The Baron, in his floating chair, who had schemed to erase a noble line from the memory of the Imperium, found instead that it was his own house that was slipping toward the shadows, while the family he had sought to destroy grew brighter and stronger with every passing season. Let that quiet turning of the scales be the thing we carry with us now, the deep satisfaction of a wrong met not with rage but with patience, and justice done at last in its proper time. Up next in Chapter 12, an emperor uneasy will rise from the desert to the highest throne of all, and see how the Padishah emperor himself grew troubled at the sight of a house that would not fall and only continued to grow. Chapter 12. An emperor uneasy, high above the affairs of the great houses, above even the ancient rivalry of the Atreides and the Harkonnen, there sat a single figure whose word could move fleets and remake worlds. He was the Padishah Emperor, Shaddam IV, ruler of the known universe, and tonight we lift our gaze from the desert of Arrakis to the golden heights of his power, and we consider the slow unease that crept into the heart of the most powerful man alive. Let the quiet turning of these great affairs carry you gently downward toward rest. The emperor ruled from Khitain, a world of splendor and ceremony, a place of vast gardens and shining halls where the light itself seemed arranged for the comfort of the throne. He was the head of House Carino, an old and mighty line that had held the imperial crown for many generations, and his authority rested upon two great pillars. The first was the Landsraad, the assembly of the great houses, whose collective strength no single power could ignore. The second was the Sardaukar, the emperor's own soldiers, warriors trained upon a prison world of such savage hardship that those who survived it became fighters of terrible skill, feared across every world of the Imperium. Between the balance of the houses and the edge of his soldiers, the emperor kept his throne, and he kept it by watching, always, for any power that might grow great enough to threaten him. It was this watchfulness that had set the whole tragedy of Arrakis in motion, for the emperor had come to fear the House of Atreides, not because they had done him any wrong, but because they had grown too well loved. Duke Leto was a man of honor and of justice, and the great houses had begun to look to him, to speak of him with admiration, to gather around him as men gather around one they trust. In the councils of the Landsraad, his voice carried a weight that troubled the throne. A cruel and hated house the emperor could tolerate, for a hated house makes no allies, but a beloved house, a house that other houses might rally to, was a different matter, and Shaddam had looked upon the rising love for the Atreides and seen in it a shadow across his own future. And so he had acted in secret and in cunning. He had lent his own Sardaukar, disguised in the colors of the Harkonnen, to the great trap upon Arrakis. He had given the Baron the tools and the blessing to destroy the Atreides, meaning to be rid of a rival while keeping his own hands clean. For the emperor could not be seen to move openly against a house that had done no wrong. In the harsher telling of this tale, the plan succeeded, and the Atreides fell, and the emperor believed himself safe. But the plan did not succeed. The house did not fall. And now the emperor faced the one thing his careful scheming had never prepared him for, which was a rival he had tried to destroy and failed. A rival who now knew, or could guess, exactly what had been done to him and by whom. This was the root of the emperor's unease. For a house that survives an attempt upon its life becomes a dangerous thing. It has been tested and has held. It has learned the measure of its enemies, and it carries, ever afterward, the knowledge of the wrong that was done to it, a knowledge that need not be spoken aloud to be understood by all. Shaddam knew that Leto knew. He could not be certain how much proof the Duke possessed, nor what the Duke might choose to do with it, and that uncertainty gnawed at him in the long, quiet hours of his splendid court. He had wagered the honor of his throne upon a swift and secret victory, and the wager had been lost, and now he must live with the reckoning of that loss stretching out before him without any clear end. Worse still, the failed treachery had not weakened the Atreides, it had strengthened them. A house that had merely been prosperous was now a house that had faced the combined malice of the Baron and the throne, and had come through it unbroken. The great houses of the Landsraad, watching from their distant worlds, understood what they had seen. They understood that the Atreides had been tried in the hottest fire and had not been consumed. And admiration mixed now with something sharper, a recognition of real strength, so that the very love the emperor had feared grew greater rather than less. The Duke who had survived became a figure larger than the Duke who had merely ruled well. And around that larger figure, the loyalties of the Imperium began, slowly, to gather. The emperor could not simply strike again. That was the bitter arithmetic of his position. To move openly against the Atreides now, after the secret attempt had failed, would be to reveal his own hand, to show the whole Landsraad that the throne had conspired against a house that had done no wrong. Such a revelation could shake the very foundation of his rule, for the great houses tolerated the emperor's authority only so long as they believed it would not be turned treacherously against themselves. If they came to believe that the throne would scheme in secret to destroy any house that grew too admired, then every house in the Imperium would have reason to fear. And fear among the great houses could gather into a storm that no Sardaukar could weather. And so the emperor found his own strength turned into a kind of cage, and the very secrecy that had let him strike now bound his hands against striking again. There was, too, the matter of the spice. For Arrakis was the only source of the melange in all the known universe, and the melange was the thing upon which the whole vast structure of the Imperium turned. The guild could not fold space without it. The emperor's own long life and the lives of all the powerful depended upon it. And now the Atreides held Arrakis more firmly than ever, allied with the desert folk, mastering the harvest, tightening their grip upon the one substance that no one, not even the emperor, could do without. To threaten the Atreides too openly was to threaten the spice, and to threaten the spice was to threaten everything, and this the emperor understood as clearly as he understood anything. The house he had wished to destroy had come to hold a hand upon the throat of the whole Imperium, gently for now, but undeniably. And so Shaddam IV, ruler of the known universe, sat in his shining halls upon Khatain, and felt, for the first time in his long reign, the ground shifting slowly beneath the imperial throne. He was not overthrown. He was not defeated. His Sardaukar were still terrible, his authority still vast, his splendor undimmed to any casual eye. But the man himself knew what he could not say aloud, that he had reached for the destruction of a rival, and had instead made that rival stronger, and that the balance of power among the thrones of the Imperium had begun, quietly and irreversibly, to change. The certainty that had once been his was gone, and in its place was watchfulness, and beneath the watchfulness, unease. Let us leave the emperor there, in the golden quiet of his court, troubled by a strength he could not undo, and let the vast, slow shifting of these great affairs settle over us like a calm. For there is a strange peace even in the troubles of the mighty, seen from a distance and told softly at the edge of sleep, the reminder that power itself must bend before patience and justice, and that even the highest throne is not beyond the reach of a quiet turning of the tide. Up next in Chapter 13, the Fremen and the Green Dream will return to the desert and to the great vision of a greening Arrakis, pursued now with the full power and the long patience of a living house. Chapter 13, the Fremen and the Green Dream. In the older story, the dream of a living Arrakis belonged to a man who died with the vision still folded inside him, passed down like a secret carried from hand to hand through the sietches. But in this gentler telling, where House Atreides never fell and the Duke Leto still walked the corridors of Arrakeen, the dream did not have to hide. It came out of the desert and into the light, and it was allowed to grow slowly, the way all true and lasting things grow, without haste and without blood. His name was Liet Kynes, and he was the imperial planetologist, the judge of the change, the servant of two masters, and the keeper of one great and quiet hope. For years he had lived a divided life, wearing the badge of the emperor and carrying in his heart the older loyalty of his father before him, the loyalty to the sand and to the people of the sand. He had watched houses come and go on Arrakis, and he had learned to trust none of them, for they came only for the spice and left only ruin. But the Atreides were different, and slowly, in the long, unhurried way of the desert, Kynes came to believe it. It began with small things, as the deepest changes so often do. The Duke asked to be shown the true face of the planet, Not the polished reports meant for distant courts, but the living map of wind and dune and hidden water. And Kynes, cautious at first, took him out beyond the shield wall, into the open bled where the sky was very wide and the silence was older than any throne. There the planetologist spoke, in his careful way, of a thing that few off-worlders had ever been permitted to understand. He spoke of water. He spoke of the ancient dream of the Fremen, a dream so vast and so patient that it was measured not in years, but in centuries. For the Fremen, it turned out, were not merely surviving on their harsh world. They were remaking it. In secret, in the deep south where no spice hunter dared to fly and no Harkonnen ever set foot, they had built their hidden gardens. They had planted grasses to hold the dunes. They had set out poverty plants and salt bushes and the first stubborn trees, and they had watched over them with a devotion that was almost holy. They had dug their catch basins and their wind traps, and drop by precious drop they had gathered the water of a whole world, storing it away in vast concealed cisterns beneath the rock. It was the wealth they never spent, the treasure they were saving for a day their grandchildren might never live to see. The Duke understood, and in understanding he was changed. For here at last was the thing he had come to Arrakis truly seeking, though he had not known its shape until he saw it. He had come for desert power, for a people who could not be bought and could not be broken, and he had found instead a people who were quietly building a paradise out of nothing but patience and faith. And he saw, with the clear eyes of a just ruler, that his house and their dream were meant for one another. So the green dream, which had always been pursued in shadow and in secret, was taken up now by a living house with all its power behind it. This was the great gift of the story that did not end in fire. For a hidden hope can only creep forward, but a hope openly shared can stride. The Duke did not seize the dream, nor did he claim it for his own glory. He did the wiser and the harder thing. He lent it his strength and asked nothing that would spoil it. Where the Fremen had smuggled seedlings in the dark, the Atreides now brought them openly, ordering the finest botanical stock the Imperium could offer, hardy grasses from 100 worlds, drought trees and desert flowers chosen with care. Where the Fremen had counted their water by the drop, the house now brought its engineers and its wealth to the counting, and the cisterns grew deeper and the wind traps grew taller. Kynes, who had spent a lifetime learning not to hope, found the old caution melting from him like frost in the morning. He walked the testing stations with young Paul at his side, showing the boy how a single tuft of grass could tame a whole moving dune, how a line of plantings could turn back the wind, how the desert itself might one day be persuaded to keep its own water instead of drinking it dry. And Paul listened, for he had the gift of listening, and he stored the knowledge away in that deep, quiet place inside him where all his strange awareness was slowly gathering. There were rules to the dream, and the planetologist taught them one by one in the low, reverent voice of a man speaking of sacred things. He taught that they must move slowly, that to green the world too quickly would be to break it, that the great sandworms of the deep desert were bound up in the whole strange balance of the spice and the sand, and that the water and the worm could not both have the world entire. This was the riddle at the heart of it all, the puzzle that would take generations to solve. For the spice that made the house rich and the water that would make the world green were, in the end, enemies of a kind. To bring the one was to endanger the other. And so the dream had to be a dream of measure, of balance, of a change so gradual that both the melange and the meadow might learn to share a single planet. Under a fallen house, such patience would have been impossible, for the desperate and the exiled cannot afford to wait. But under a house that had endured, patience became the whole method. The Duke gave orders that the greening should never be rushed, that the spice sands of the deep desert should be left to the worms and the harvesters, and that the change should begin only in the chosen places, spreading outward at the speed of growing things. He set aside the wealth of a portion of the spice to feed the slow work, so that every harvest of the present quietly paid for a greener future. It was a strange accounting, a ledger written in centuries, but the Duke had learned from the Fremen the piece of thinking in long time. And the people of the sand, watching, came to a new understanding of the house that ruled them. They had trusted the Atreides for their justice and for the water discipline the Duke honored. But now, they trusted them with the deepest thing of all, the dream itself. Stilgar and the other Nabes walked with Kynes and the Duke through the hidden plantations, and where once a Naib would have hidden such places from any off-worlder on pain of death, now they showed them freely. For the off-worlder had become, in some quiet and unlooked-for way, one of their own. So the green dream, which in another and sadder telling had flickered like a lamp in a storm, burned now with a steady and a growing light. It was not yet spring on Arrakis, and it would not be spring for a very long while, perhaps not until Paul himself was an old man with grandchildren of his own. But the first grasses held the first dunes, and the first trees drank the first gathered water, and somewhere in the vast and patient silence of the deep south, a world that had been only sand for uncounted ages began, ever so gently, to imagine that it might one day be green. Up next in Chapter 14, Kwisatz Haderach Unforced, we'll follow young Paul as his strange gifts awaken slowly and softly, without the fire of grief, in a house where his father still lives, and the future opens like a flower rather than a wound. Chapter 14. Kwisatz Haderach Unforced. In the story the universe first told, the young heir of House Atreides came into his terrible gifts through fire and loss. He was cast into the desert with his mother, his father slain, his home in ruins, and it was the crucible of grief and exile that burned away everything soft in him and left the hard, bright edge of prophecy behind. But this is not that story. In this telling the Duke lived, the house held, and so the boy called Paul came into his strange inheritance by a gentler road, and the awakening that in another life had been a wound became instead a slow unfolding, like a bud that opens petal by petal in a quiet garden. For many generations, the Bene Gesserit sisterhood had bred toward a single secret hope. Through their long and patient breeding program, guiding the marriages of the great houses across the centuries, they sought to bring forth one they called the Kwisatz Haderach, a name that meant the shortening of the way. He would be a male who could do what their reverend mothers could do, and more. One whose inner eye could look where theirs could not, into the deep places of memory and time that their training forbade them to enter. He would bridge space and time in his mind. He would be the one who could be many places at once. And Paul, son of Leto and of Jessica, stood at the very threshold of that long design, closer to it than any who had come before. The Lady Jessica had been ordered to bear only daughters, for the sisterhood's careful ledger called for a daughter in her generation, a girl to be wed in the next turning of the plan. But Jessica had loved her Duke, and out of that love she had borne him a son instead, and so the plan had leapt forward by a generation, arriving before the sisters were ready for it. In the darker telling, this early arrival was forced hotter still by catastrophe. Here, in the sheltered peace of a house that endured, it was allowed simply to ripen. The gifts came to Paul quietly, and they came first in sleep. He had always been a dreamer, and his dreams had always had a strange weight to them, a way of showing him things before they came to pass. A face he had never seen would appear to him in the night, and weeks later, he would meet that face in a corridor of Arrakis. A word would be spoken in his dreaming, and he would hear it spoken aloud by waking lips. At first, these were small things, easily mistaken for coincidence, and a frightened boy in a broken house might have taken them for madness or for grief. But Paul was not frightened, for his father was alive and his mother was near, and there were wise and steady people all around him to whom he could turn. And so, instead of fearing the visions, he learned to watch them with a calm and curious eye. His mother helped him in the careful way that only she could. Jessica had been trained from girlhood in the deep disciplines of the sisterhood, the control of the body and the mind, the reading of the smallest signs, the still and watchful inner quiet. Though she had turned aside from the sisterhood's plan when she bore her son, she had not forgotten her learning, and now she gave it to Paul. Gently, a little at a time. She taught him the litany against fear, the words a person says in the dark to let the fear pass through and leave nothing behind. She taught him to still his breathing and to slow his racing heart. She taught him to watch his own mind as a person might watch a wide and quiet sea, noticing the waves without being tossed by them. There was in Arrakis a place where the spice was in everything, in the food and the water and the very air, and the spice was the key that turned the lock of Paul's awareness. The melange that made the navigators of the guild fold space, that lengthened the lives of those who took it, that stained the eyes of the Fremen a deep and total blue, worked its slow work on the boy as well. But because he took it not in one desperate flood, but in the ordinary daily way of anyone who lived upon Arrakis, its gifts came to him as a tide comes to a shore, rising a little each day, never once a drowning. His inner eye opened by degrees. The narrow present widened. He began to see not one future but many, a great branching fan of paths, each choice a fork, each fork 100 forks beyond it, the whole vast tree of what might be spreading out before him in the dark behind his eyes. This was a heavy thing to carry, and in the other life it had nearly broken him, for a mind flooded all at once with the roar of time can lose itself in the flood. But Paul carried it lightly here, because he did not carry it alone. When the visions crowded him and the branching futures grew too loud, he could walk out onto a balcony of the great fortress and find his father there, the Duke Leto, looking out over the sea-etched hills. And he could sit beside him in the cooling evening and let the ordinary love of a father steady the strange and lonely gift of the son. Leto did not fully understand what moved in his boy, for these were mysteries far outside the learning of a duke. But he understood the boy himself, and that was enough. He gave Paul the one thing the visions could not give, which was the plain and solid ground of belonging, the knowledge that he was loved not for what he might become, but simply for what he was. Thufir Hawat, the old mentat, watched the boy grow into his powers and marveled quietly. For a mentat's mind was itself a kind of trained prophecy, a human computer that could reckon the odds of what was to come. Yet Hawat saw that Paul's gift was of another order entirely, not a reckoning of probabilities, but a seeing, and he bent his own great skill to helping the boy sort the true visions from the false, the likely path from the unlikely. And Gurney Halleck taught him still the old arts of blade and body, so that the boy who could see the future was also a boy who was strong and quick and whole in the present, grounded in his own two hands and his own beating heart. And so the Kwisatz Haderach, when at last he began to know himself for what he was not a creature of vengeance forged in a furnace of loss. He was a young man of a living house, awakening slowly to a vast responsibility, learning by patient degrees to look upon the terrible fan of possible tomorrows without flinching and without being consumed. He saw, far off, the dark paths that another Paul in another life might have walked. the paths of war without end. And he saw too the gentler ways that a house at peace might yet make possible. He did not have to choose in haste, for he had time and a father and a home and the slow quiet counsel of those who loved him. The way had been shortened, as the old name promised, but for the first time in all the long generations of the plan, it had been shortened without breaking the one who walked it. Up next, in Chapter 15, The Landsraad Watches, we'll turn our gaze outward to the great houses of the Imperium and the shifting balance of thrones. As an Atreides house, neither fallen nor crushed rises to a new and watchful weight among the councils of the powerful. Chapter 15, The Landsraad Watches. Far above the sands of Arrakis, in the halls and drawing rooms of 1,000 worlds, the great and ancient game of the Imperium went on as it always had. It was a game of houses, played across the whole width of the settled stars, and its board was the assembly of the noble families called the Landsraad. Here the great houses met and spoke and schemed, each guarding its own honor and its own holdings, each watching all the others with a courtesy that was often only a thin and glittering skin drawn over centuries of rivalry. And in this telling, where House Atreides did not fall upon Arrakis, but instead grew strong there, the whole slow balance of that great game began, quietly, to shift. To understand the shift, one must understand the shape of the Imperium itself, for it was a strange and delicate structure, a balance of three great powers leaning against one another like stones in an arch. There was the Padishah Emperor, Shaddam IV, who sat the Golden Lion throne and commanded the dreaded soldier fanatics called the Sardaukar, terrible warriors bred and hardened on a prison world. There was the Landsraad, the assembly of all the noble houses whose combined strength no single throne could ever quite defy. And there was the Spacing Guild, holder of the monopoly on travel between the stars, without whose ships no army could move and no house could reach another. These three leaned upon each other, and the whole vast peace of the Imperium rested upon their leaning. For if any one of them grew too strong, the arch would crack and the stones would fall. Into this ancient balance the Atreides now brought a new and unexpected weight. For a house that holds Arrakis holds the spice, and the spice was the one substance upon which the whole of civilization turned. It was the melange that let the guild navigators guide their great ships safely across the folds of space. It was the melange that lengthened the lives of the wealthy and sharpened the sight of the wise. It was, in a very real sense, the blood of the Imperium, and the world that produced it was the single most valuable holding among all the 10,000 worlds. In the older and sadder telling, the Atreides had held that prize for only the briefest span before it was torn from them. But here they held it, and held it well, and the holding changed everything. The other great houses of the Landsraad watched, and their watching was a study in the many faces of nobility. Some watched with admiration, for the tale of the failed betrayal had traveled far, and there was not a house in the Imperium that did not know how the trap had been laid and how it had been broken. The Duke Leto had long been beloved among his peers, a man whose word was iron and whose honor was beyond the buying. And now that beloved Duke had done the impossible. He had walked into the most dangerous fief in the Imperium. He had survived the treachery that was meant to end him, and he had come out of it stronger than before. There were houses that had quietly wished him well in his danger, and those houses rejoiced, though quietly, as all things were done quietly in the Landsraad. Some watched with envy, for the wealth of the spice was a wealth beyond reckoning, and there is no envy so keen as the envy of one great family for the sudden rising of another. These houses said little in the open councils, But in their private halls they weighed and measured and calculated, wondering how the Atreides had done it and whether the doing could be undone. Yet even envy was tempered by caution, for the manner of the Atreides' survival had taught a sharp lesson to any who might have dreamed of moving against them. A house that could turn a perfect trap back upon its makers was not a house to be lightly challenged. And some watched with a wary respect that was, in the strange arithmetic of power, worth more than either love or envy. For the Landsraad had lived long under the shadow of the Emperor and his Sardaukar, and every noble family carried in its memory the old fear that the throne might one day decide to break them, one by one, until nothing stood between the Emperor and total mastery. The Atreides, holding the spice and bound to the fierce and uncountable Fremen, had become something the Landsraad had lacked for a long time, which was a counterweight. Here was a house strong enough that even the throne must think twice before crossing it, and a house strong in that way was, to the other houses, a kind of shield. If the Atreides could not be easily broken, then perhaps no house could be easily broken, and in that thought there was a cold comfort that spread through the whole assembly. The Duke, for his part, played the great game with a patience he had learned in the desert. He did not boast of his new strength, nor did he flaunt the wealth that flowed from the spice. He sent his envoys to the Landsraad with the same grave courtesy he had always shown, and he took up his house's ancient rights and duties in the assembly as though nothing had changed. But everyone knew that everything had changed, and his very restraint made his strength the more impressive. For a strong man who does not raise his voice is heeded more closely than a weak man who shouts. He built alliances slowly, house by house, offering fair trade in the spice, keeping his bargains to the letter, and winning by steady honor the friendships that others tried to win by gold and threat. There was in this a lesson that the wiser heads of the Landsraad marked well. The Atreides did not seek to overturn the balance of the great arch. They sought instead to stand within it as a firm new stone, adding their weight in a way that made the whole structure stronger rather than throwing it down. This was a rare thing in the game of houses, where so many played only to rise by the falling of others, and it earned the house a trust that mere power could never have bought. The Duke understood, as few in that grasping assembly understood, that a house which makes its neighbors safer is a house its neighbors will fight to protect. Yet not all the watching was friendly, and beneath the courtesies there ran darker currents. There were those bound to the Harkonnen cause, and those who served the throne's deeper designs, and these watched the Atreides rising with a colder eye. They saw a house that would not fall, and they wondered what such a house might become in a generation, or in two. They noted the strange rumors that drifted out of Arrakis, the tales of the Duke's son who was said to be beloved of the Fremen as no off-worlder had ever been, the whispers of a boy with uncanny sight, and the sisterhood of the Bene Gesserit who watched all the houses always, watched the Atreides most closely of all, for their long plan had gone in an unlooked-for direction, and they did not yet know whether to fear it or to bless it. So the Landsraad watched, 1,000 houses turning their many eyes toward one desert world, and the slow tides of power shifted beneath the glittering surface of the game. Nothing broke, and nothing burned, for this was a time of balance rather than of war. But the arch of the Imperium had a new stone in it now, and though the whole vast structure still stood, as it had stood for ages, it stood a little differently than before, leaning its ancient weight toward a house that had refused to fall. Up next, in Chapter 16, Chani and Paul, in a Kinderworld, will leave the councils of the mighty and return to the sand, to a quiet love unfolding between a desert daughter and a duke's son, in a world where no war and no vengeance is allowed to cast its shadow across their tenderness. Chapter 16, Chani and Paul, in a Kinderworld. Away from the councils of the great houses, away from the weighing of thrones and the slow turning of the vast machinery of the Imperium, there was a smaller and a sweeter story unfolding among the sietches of the deep desert. It was the oldest story of all, the one that has been told in every age and on every world since the first two hearts found each other under the first wide sky. It was a love story, and in this gentle telling it was allowed to be only that, a tenderness growing quietly in its own good time, unshadowed by war, unhurried by grief, permitted at last to simply be. Her name was Chani, and she was a daughter of the desert. She was the child of the planetologist Liet Kynes and of a Fremen woman, and so she carried in her the two great loves of Arrakis, the love of the Sand People for their harsh and holy world, and the deeper dream of the greening that her father had given his life to serve. She was small and fierce and swift, with the total blue eyes of one raised on the spice, and she had grown up in the sietches, learning the ways of water and worm, of blade and stillsuit, of the long, patient discipline by which the Fremen wrung life from a world that seemed to offer none. She was, in the way of her people, entirely without softness in the face of danger, and yet there was in her a warmth that ran deep and steady, like the hidden water beneath the rock. Paul came to know her in the ordinary course of his life among the Fremen, for in this telling he was no exile flung desperate into the desert, but a welcome guest, and in time a trusted friend of the sietch. He came and went between Arrakis and the deep desert as a young man of the ruling house, learning the ways of the sand from those who knew them best, and Chani was among his teachers, for she knew the desert as well as any and better than most. She showed him the small signs that meant water was near, and the great signs that meant a worm was rising, and the reading of the wind, and the patience that the sand demands. And in the showing, as so often happens, the teacher and the student began to see each other with a new and warmer light. There was no grand and sudden declaration between them, for that was not the way of the desert, and it was not the way of these two careful hearts. Their love grew as the plantings grew in Kynes' hidden gardens, slowly and steadily, a little more with each meeting, sending down roots before it ever showed a flower. They walked the ridgelines together in the cool of the evening, when the great sun had gone down and the sand gave back its heat to the darkening sky. They sat in the common rooms of the sietch and listened to the old songs. They shared the small silences that are the truest language of those who are coming to love one another, the comfortable quiet in which two people can simply be near without any need for words. What made this love so different from the love that might have been in a harsher telling was the absence of the shadow. In the sadder story, the young man and the desert daughter had found each other in the midst of a gathering storm. Their tenderness always shot through with the knowledge of coming war, their every joy stolen from between the fingers of grief and vengeance. There the love had been real and deep, but it had been a love lived under a lowering sky, forever bracing against the blow that was sure to come. Here there was no such blow. The house had not fallen. The Duke lived. The Harkonnen had been answered, and the desperate holy war that in another life had swept out from Arrakis to drown a whole galaxy in blood had never been kindled at all. And so Chani and Paul were free, as few lovers in that troubled age were free, to let their love be nothing more or less than love. This freedom was a rarer and a more precious thing than either of them fully knew. For Paul carried within him the strange and heavy gift of sight, the inner eye that showed him the branching futures, and among those futures he had glimpsed the darker paths, the ones where love became a thing bound up with slaughter, where the woman he cherished became a figure in a vision of endless war. He had seen those paths, and he had turned from them, and part of what let him turn was Chani herself. For she was to him not a symbol and not a prize, and not a piece in the great game of prophecy, but simply a person, warm and near and real, whose hand in his was worth more than all the crowns of all the thrones. In loving her plainly, as one heart loves another, he kept himself anchored to the ordinary human world. And that anchoring was itself a kind of salvation. The Lady Jessica watched the growing love with the careful eye of a mother and the deeper eye of one trained in the reading of hearts. In another life she might have watched with sorrow, knowing all the loss that hung over such a union. Here she watched with a quiet gladness, for she saw in Chani a strength and a steadiness that would serve her son well, and she saw in the love between them a thing that would keep Paul whole. She had turned aside from the cold designs of her sisterhood for the sake of love once already, when she bore the Duke a son against all their careful planning, and she knew better than anyone the worth of a love freely chosen over a match coldly arranged. She welcomed the desert daughter in her grave and gentle way, and Chani in turn came to trust the Duke's lady as she trusted few outside her own people. The Duke Leto, too, looked upon the match with favor, though he was wise enough to let it grow at its own pace and never to force it. He had come to Arrakis dreaming of a bond between his house and the desert power, and here was that bond taking on the sweetest form it could possibly take. Not a treaty written on paper, nor an alliance sealed with gold, but a love blossoming between his own son and a daughter of the sand. Such bonds, he knew, outlast all others, for they are written not in ink, but in the blood of the generations to come. And so he gave the young lovers his blessing, quietly, in the way of a father who is glad and does not need to make a great show of his gladness. And so, while the great houses of the Landsraad watched the balance of thrones, and while the hidden gardens greened by slow degrees in the deep south, two young hearts found each other under the desert stars, and were allowed, for once, to simply be happy. There would be a life ahead of them, long and full, with all the ordinary joys and small ordinary sorrows that any life must hold. There would be a home, and in time there would be children, and the desert daughter and the Duke's son would grow old together on a world that was slowly turning green around them. But all of that was still to come. For now there was only the cool of the evening, and the wide and quiet sky, and two people walking side by side along a ridge of darkening sand, content in each other, in a world made kind at last. Up next in Chapter 17, The Golden Path Glimpsed, we'll follow Paul's inner eye out to the very edge of what can be seen, to the far and terrible vision of humanity's long survival, and to the dreadful choice that a house at peace might yet carry more gently than any before it. Chapter 17. The Golden Path Glimpsed. There are visions that arrive like weather, soft and expected, and there are visions that arrive like a door opening onto a room no one knew was there. For Paul Atreides, growing now into the fullness of his strange inheritance, the deepest of these came not in the crucible of grief, as it might have in another and harsher life, but in the long, unhurried quiet of a house that had survived. He had time. That was the great difference, and it changed everything about how he met the thing that waited inside his own mind. He had a father who lived, a mother who was near, a people who trusted him, and beneath his feet a fortress that had held. And so when the far and terrible shape of the future first showed itself to him, he did not have to face it as a hunted boy in the dark. He faced it as a young man who had slept in a warm bed, who had eaten at a full table, who knew he was loved. The spice had opened his inner sight slowly, over seasons rather than in a single shattering night. Melange was in the air of Arrakis, in the food, in the water of every sietch, and the more he lived within the desert, the more the veils within him thinned. At first, the prescience came only as small things, a knowledge of who would enter a room a moment before they did, a sense of which path across the dunes was safe and which would wake the deep. These were gentle gifts, and he learned to hold them gently. But as he grew, the visions widened, and one evening, sitting far out on the open sand with the stars coming awake above him, the widest of them all unfolded, and he saw the long road of humankind stretching away into a distance so vast that time itself seemed to bend beneath it. He saw, in that far seeing, the great danger that lay ahead for all people, not in his lifetime and not in his son's, but in the slow accumulation of ages. He saw how a species grown comfortable and gathered into a few hands could grow brittle, could forget how to endure, could be swept away in a single catastrophe because it had placed all its hopes in one basket and one path. He saw the narrowing of the human future to a single thread, and he saw how that thread might be cut. And he understood, with the calm, awful clarity that the spice gave, that there existed a road by which humanity might be made unkillable, scattered so wide and taught so deep a hunger to survive that no disaster could ever gather them all into one killing blow. This was the road that in other tellings men would come to call the Golden Path, and it was golden the way a desert noon is golden, beautiful and merciless at once. In another life, a life of exile and war and terrible loss, a man might have felt that road as a compulsion, a thing he was driven toward because every other door had been shut behind him by grief. But Paul stood at the mouth of it in a world where the doors were still open. He looked down that long, shining, terrible way, and because he was not desperate, because he had not been broken, he found that he could look at it steadily and choose. The vision did not own him, it counseled him. And that was a freedom that few who had ever glimpsed such a thing had been given. He carried the seeing home across the sand, and he did not carry it alone for long. He brought it, in time and with care, to his father, and Leto listened the way a good duke listens to a scout returned from far country, without flinching and without haste. He brought it to his mother, and Jessica, who had been trained in the deep disciplines of the Bene Gesserit, understood at once both the weight of what her son had seen and the mercy of the circumstances in which he had seen it. Between the three of them, in the long evenings of the great house, the far vision was turned over and examined like a stone held up to the light, and slowly it began to change its character. What had first loomed as a single dreadful necessity became, in the hands of a family that had time, something closer to a question. If humanity must be made to endure, must it be made to endure through suffering alone? Or might the same distance, the same wide scattering, the same deep-rooted refusal to die be reached by patience instead of by pain? Paul had seen that the surest roads to survival ran through fire. But he had also seen, faintly, at the edges of the vision where the mist gathered, other roads, longer roads, slower roads, roads that did not demand the breaking of a people in order to save them. In a life of exile, he might never have had the leisure to trace those fainter lines, for a hunted man takes the first road that leads out of the trap. But Paul was not hunted. He could sit with the vision for years if he wished, walking its branchings over and over, searching the mist for the gentler ways. And so the terrible choice that might have fallen on him all at once as a single crushing burden was instead deferred and reshaped and carried between many hands, a little at a time, the way a heavy load is carried far when it is shared. This did not make the vision less true. The danger to the far human future was real, and Paul never pretended otherwise. He knew that somewhere down the long ages, the thread might still narrow, and he taught himself to keep watch over it, as a shepherd keeps watch over a flock through a long night. But he also came to believe in the peace of that surviving house, that a path chosen freely and walked slowly might reach the same far country as a path chosen in agony and walked at a run. The destination was survival. The Atreides had already proven, on their own small scale and in their own single lifetime, that survival could be won without the loss of one's soul. Perhaps, Paul thought, the same might be true on the scale of all humankind. So, the golden path, in this world, was glimpsed rather than seized. It hung on the far horizon of Paul's inner sight, like a mountain range seen across a great plain, undeniable, immense, but not yet climbed, and not to be climbed in fear. He returned from each vision, not diminished, but steadied, and the steadiness spread outward from him into the household, and from the household into the desert, so that the people who followed the Atreides felt, without quite knowing why, that their young lord carried some far knowledge that made him gentle rather than grim. He had looked upon the longest of all roads. He had seen how humanity might be saved, and because he had been permitted to see it while surrounded by love, he had learned that even the heaviest of futures can be met with an open hand instead of a clenched one. The stars turned slowly over Arrakis. Paul slept, and his dreams were wide but not cruel. And in the morning, the desert was still there, patient and golden and waiting, holding its long secrets for whoever would come to them without haste. Up next in Chapter 18, A Duke's Long Reign, will settle into the years of Leto's rule on Arrakis, the quiet justice of his court, the prospering Sietches, and the first green beginnings of a world remade by patience. Chapter 18. A Duke's Long Reign. Years are the truest measure of a house, more than any single victory or any single day of glory. A house may win a battle in an afternoon, but only in the slow turning of many seasons does it show whether it can rule. House Atreides, having survived the trap laid for it on Arrakis, now entered upon the long work of governance, and it was in this long work, more than in any clash of shields, that Duke Leto revealed the fullest measure of the man he was. He had been called Leto the Just on the ocean world of Caladan, and he carried that name with him into the desert, and there, upon the harshest world in all the Imperium, he made the name mean even more than it had meant before. His court at Arrakis was not a place of trembling. In many great houses of the Landsraad, to stand before one's lord was to stand before a power that might crush you on a whim, and men learned to speak carefully and to hide their faces. But Leto had learned, from a lifetime of watching the cruelty of the Harkonnens, exactly what he did not wish to be, and he governed by its opposite. He listened. He heard the water sellers and the spice workers and the elders of the Sietches, and he heard them not as a performance of mercy, but because he genuinely wished to know how his people fared. Grievances that in other realms would have festered for a generation were brought into the open air of his hall and settled there, and men went away from him, feeling that they had been weighed on honest scales. The Sietches prospered under this reign, and their prospering was a thing that would have astonished the Arrakis of old. For the Fremen, who had lived for uncounted years in hiding, hoarding their water and their numbers and their dreams, now found that they had a duke who did not wish to strip their world of its wealth and leave them the dust. The spice still flowed outward to the Imperium, for the melange trade was the beating heart of all interstellar commerce, and no house could hold Arrakis without it. But the terms of that flow had changed. The men who gathered the spice were no longer worked to death by overseers who cared nothing for them. They were paid and protected and counted, and the water that was once wrung from them was left in their keeping. And so the deep desert, which had once given the Imperium only its riches and its silence, now began to give it something new, a people rising slowly out of hiding into the light of an ordered peace. Justice, in Leto's hands, was patient. He did not rush to judgment, and he did not rule by fear of the sudden stroke. When disputes came before him between the folk of the towns and the folk of the sand, he weighed the old ways of the Fremen against the laws of the wider Imperium, and sought the seam where both might be honored. He knew that a desert people who had survived on discipline and loyalty could not simply be handed the customs of far green worlds and told to live by them. And so, he let the Fremen keep their own councils and their own leaders, chief among them Stilgar, who had become across the years less a wary ally and more a trusted friend. A man whose word Leto valued as highly as that of any lord of the Landsrod. Between the fortress at Arrakis and the sietches of the deep desert there grew a bond that was not conquest and was not surrender, but something rarer, a partnership of two peoples who had each decided that the other was worth trusting. And through all these years, quietly, almost secretly at first, the great dream began. Far out in the southern latitudes, in hidden basins and sheltered places, the work of the planetologist Kynes and those who had followed his vision continued and deepened. And now it went forward with the full weight of a living house behind it. Plantings that had once been the desperate hope of a few hidden botanists became the patient policy of a duke. Water was set aside, not squandered, but invested, poured into the long, slow labor of coaxing green life from a world that had known only sand. A blade of grass here, a hardy shrub there, a stand of low trees clinging to a windbreak in a place where, within living memory, nothing had grown at all. It was slow beyond the patience of most rulers, for a world is not greened in a reign or even in a lifetime. But Leto had learned patience from the desert itself, and he taught it to his stewards, and the greening, once begun in earnest, did not stop. The people saw these first green things, and they were changed by the seeing. For a Fremen, water was life, and to see it given freely to the growing of plants, to see the promise that one day the open desert might bloom, was to see a dream that their grandmothers had whispered of by night made suddenly and cautiously real. They did not grow soft. The desert was still the desert, still vast and still deadly, and the discipline of the sand did not slacken. But hope has a way of straightening the back, and the folk of Arrakis carried themselves a little differently in the years of Leto's long reign, as people do when they have begun to believe that tomorrow might be kinder than yesterday. Leto himself aged as all men age, and the desert marked him. His hair silvered, and the lines of his face deepened, and the weight of many decisions settled onto his shoulders and stayed there. But it was a good weight, the weight of a man who had chosen to carry his people rather than to ride upon them, and he bore it without complaint. In the evenings he would sometimes stand upon the high walls of the fortress and look out across the darkening sands toward the places where the green was beginning, and those who saw him there said that he looked less like a conqueror surveying a prize and more like a gardener surveying a field he had planted and did not expect to see fully grown. He had made his peace with time. He knew that the world he was building was a world for his son and his son's sons, and that knowing did not sadden him. It steadied him, the way the far vision had steadied Paul. His house grew strong around him, not with the brittle strength of fear, but with the deep strength of loyalty freely given. Men served the Atreides because they wished to, and that kind of service does not break when the wind turns. Thufir Hawat, grown old in the family's council, watched the ledgers and the balances and found, to his own weathered satisfaction, that a house ruled by justice could also be a house that prospered, that the two were not enemies as the cynical of the Imperium believed. Duncan Idaho trained a new generation in the fighting arts and taught them, along with the sword, the harder discipline of knowing when the sword should stay in its sheath. And over all of it, Leto presided, the Duke who had lived, ruling a world that was slowly, patiently, learning to live as well. Up next in Chapter 19, The House That Endured. We'll follow House Atreides across the long span of the years, the desert changing beneath its care, and the future opening wide and green where once there had been only sand. Chapter 19. The House That Endured. To endure is a quieter thing than to conquer, and a harder one. Conquest is the work of an afternoon or a campaign, a flash of will that spends itself and is gone. But endurance is the work of generations, the patient holding of what has been won against the slow erosions of time, and it asks of a house not the courage of a single hour, but a steadiness that must be renewed every day for years beyond counting. House Atreides, which had once stood upon the very edge of ruin on the sands of Arrakis, now proved that it possessed this rarer and deeper strength. And across the long span of the years, it did not merely survive. It grew, and it deepened, and it became, at last, a thing that seemed less like a fortune and more like a fixture of the world, as though the desert had always meant to have it there. The years moved over Arrakis the way the great dunes move, slowly, almost imperceptibly, and yet leaving everything changed. What had begun as a few daring plantings in hidden southern basins spread outward, patch by patient patch, until the green was no longer a secret, but a visible fact upon the face of the planet. Grasses took hold where sand had shifted. Hardy trees rose in sheltered valleys and threw down roots that held the soil against the wind. Basins that had lain dry and dead since before the memory of any living Fremen began, cautiously, to hold moisture, and around that moisture life gathered as it always does. The change was slow enough that a person might live a whole ordinary span and see only a little of it, and yet fast enough that the elders could point to hillsides and tell the young that within their own memory nothing had grown there at all. The desert was not conquered. It was courted patiently, and it began, slowly, to answer. And still the spice flowed. This was the wonder that the wise of the Imperium had thought impossible, that a world might be greened and yet remain the source of melange, that life might be brought to Arrakis without killing the thing that made Arrakis matter. The Atreides walked this narrow way with the same care they had brought to everything, learning where the great worms could still live and thrive, learning which lands might be given to green and which must be left to sand, holding the balance between the old, harsh Arrakis and the new, gentler one. It was the most delicate governance in all the human worlds, and the fact that it held, year after year, was itself a kind of monument to the patience of the house that ruled there. Leto lived to see much of this, and it was his great reward. The Duke who had once expected, in the darkest reckoning of his advisors, to die betrayed upon a world not his own, instead grew old upon that world as its honored lord, and watched the green climb the hills he had ordered planted. When at last the years took him, as the years take all men, he did not go as a man cut down, but as a man who had finished his work and could lay it into steady hands. His people mourned him deeply, for they had loved him truly, and the mourning of the desert for Leto the Just was a thing spoken of for generations afterward, the Sietches sending their elders across the sands to stand in silence beneath the walls of Arrakis. But it was a mourning without bitterness, for there was nothing unfinished in his passing, no wound left open, no revenge left uncollected. He had lived his full span, and he had built something that would outlast him, and that is as much as any man may ask of his time. Into his place stepped Paul, no longer the boy who had first felt the spice open his inner sight, but a man come fully into his strange gifts and into the harder gift of rule. He had been prepared for this across long, unhurried years, standing at his father's side, learning the weight of the ledger and the balance of the councils, and the slow art of listening. And so, the passing of the duchy from father to son was not a rupture, but a continuation. The same steady hand upon the same steady tiller, and the house did not falter in the changing. Paul ruled as Leto had ruled, by justice and by patience, and he brought to that rule the far sight that few lords in history had ever possessed, the ability to see, dimly and gently, the long shape of the roads ahead. He used that sight not to grasp, but to guard, watching over the far human future the way a man watches over a sleeping child, alert but unhurried, ready but not afraid. Beside him through these years was Chani, and the love between them, which had grown in a world without war to darken it, had deepened into the settled and unshakable thing that only long years can make. Their children were born into a house at peace and a world turning slowly green, and they grew up knowing neither exile nor terror, only the wide desert and the rising life within it, and the steady love of parents who had time to give them. So the line of the Atreides went forward, not as a thread stretched thin and near to breaking, but as a broadening river, gathering strength as it went. The Landsraad, which had once watched Arrakis with the wary eyes of great powers, uncertain what a rising house might mean, came in time to regard the Atreides not as an upstart to be feared, but as a fixed and steadying weight in the balance of the Imperium, a house whose word was good and whose justice was known. The old enemies had long since been answered and settled. The old traps had long since sprung and failed, and what remained was simply the fact of the house, enduring, respected, secure, its roots grown deep into the sand and the new soil of the world it had made its own. If a traveler had come to Arrakis in those later years, one who had known the old planet of dust and death, that traveler would scarcely have believed the changing. Where there had been only the endless dunes, there were now, in places, the low green shapes of growing things, and the glint of held water, and the sound, astonishing on that world, of wind moving through leaves. The worms still ran in the deep desert, vast and ancient and undisturbed in the lands left to them. The spice still rose, but over all of it lay a new gentleness, the patient work of a house that had refused to fall and had spent the strength of its survival not upon vengeance, but upon making a harsh world kinder. The future, which had once seemed to narrow toward disaster, had instead opened wide and green, and House Atreides stood at the heart of that opening, enduring, as it had promised the desert it would. Up next in Chapter 20, a quiet evening on Arrakis will come at last to rest, to a family that lived, to the sands cooling under the stars, and to the soft close of a story settling gently into peace. Chapter 20. A quiet evening on Arrakis. And so, at the last, the story comes to rest, as all good stories do, in a quiet place at the close of a long day. Imagine, then, an evening upon Arrakis in the fullness of the years, when everything that was hard has softened, and everything that was won has settled into peace. The sun, which has ruled the desert sky all day with its fierce golden weight, sinks slowly now toward the far dunes. And as it sinks, its light turns from white to amber, to a deep and gentle rose, and the great heat of the day begins at last to lift. The sands, which have burned beneath that sun since morning, begin to cool, and the cooling spreads across the world like a slow exhaled breath. And everything that lives upon Arrakis feels the coming of the kind and quiet night. From the high walls of the fortress at Arrakeen, the desert stretches away as it always has, vast and patient and beautiful. But it is not quite the desert it once was. Here and there, in the sheltered places and along the windbreaks, the eye can find the low green shapes of growing things, dark now against the fading light, and the faint glint of water held in careful basins. catching the last of the sun. The wind that moves across the walls carries, along with the old dry scent of sand and spice, a new scent, faint and green and living, the smell of a world that has begun to bloom. It is a small thing, that greenness, set against the immensity of the dunes. But it is real, and it is growing, and it is enough. Within the great house, the lamps are being lit against the coming dark, one by one, soft and golden in the deepening blue of evening. And in these warm rooms there is a family, whole and living, gathered together at the close of the day. This is the heart of the whole long tale, the thing that all of it has been for. A house that might have fallen did not fall. A duke who might have died did not die. A boy who might have been driven into exile and grief and terrible war grew instead into a man surrounded by love, and came into his strange far gifts gently, and learned to carry the weight of the future with an open hand. And a desert people who lived for uncounted years in hiding came at last into the light of a lasting peace, and began to make their harsh world kinder. All of it held. All of it endured. There is no war coming over the horizon tonight. There is no traitor hidden in the walls, no assault gathering in the dark, no reckoning left uncollected. The old enemies have long been answered. The old traps have long since failed. The great and terrible roads that Paul once glimpsed in his far-seeing still lie somewhere out along the edge of time, but they are watched over now by a house that has learned patience, and they no longer loom as they once did. Tonight there is only the family, and the warm lamplight, and the slow settling of a world at peace. Tonight there is only rest. Think, if you like, of the ones who made this story, gathered now in the quiet. Think of the old duke who ruled by justice, and of the son who took up that rule and carried it forward with the same steady hand. Think of the lady who was mother and counselor both, whole and unhunted, watching her family grow around her in safety. Think of the desert love that was allowed to simply grow, without the shadow of grief to darken it, and of the children born into a house at peace, who would never know the terror their line had so narrowly escaped. Think of the loyal ones, the men who stayed and served not from fear, but from love, whose names were spoken with respect in the sietches and the halls alike. All of them are here, in this quiet evening, and all of them are safe, and all of them are at rest. Outside, the last of the sun slips beneath the dunes, and the stars come out over Arrakis one by one, more and more of them, until the whole vast desert sky is filled with their soft, cold light. The sands lie cooling beneath that light, silver now instead of gold, stretching away in long, smooth waves toward a horizon that has, at last, nothing frightening upon it. Far out in the deep desert, the great worms move through the dark as they have always moved, ancient and undisturbed, keepers of the deep places, and the spice rises as it has always risen, and the world turns slowly on toward morning. But that morning is hours away yet, and there is no need to hurry toward it. There is only the night, wide and gentle and full of stars, and the slow, soft breathing of a world at ease. The green things sleep in their sheltered valleys, their roots deep in the new soil, waiting patiently for the dawn. The people sleep in their sietches and their towns, safe beneath the same wide sky, their water in their keeping and their future secure. And in the great house at Arrakis, the lamps burn low and lower, and the family that lived settles at last toward sleep, warm and whole and at peace, with nothing left to fear and nothing left to guard against, only the long, kind night to rest in. This is where we leave them, not in the middle of a battle, not on the edge of a loss, not in the shadow of some terrible thing to come, but here, in the soft and settled quiet of an evening that has earned its peace. The House of Atreides did not fall. It lived, and it endured, and it made a harsh world gentle. And now, at the close of the long day, it rests, and the desert rests with it, cooling under the stars, patient and beautiful, and, at long last, at ease. Let the quiet settle over everything now, the way the cool of evening settles over the sand. Let the lamps burn low. Let the stars keep their slow watch over a world that is safe. There is nothing more that needs doing tonight. Nothing more to hold or to guard or to fear. The story has come to its rest, and so may you. Breathe slowly and let the long day go, and let the wide, gentle night take you, the way it takes the sleeping desert, softly and without hurry, down and down into a deep and easy rest. The sands are cool, the stars are bright, the house that endured is quiet and whole, and all across Arrakis, under the wide and peaceful sky, everything that lives is settling gently, at long last, into sleep. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we followed a house at its height, and a gift that was a trap, the long move to Dune, and a betrayal that this time failed. We watched a duke who lived, a desert alliance kept, Paul walking among the Fremen openly, with his father still beside him, and the spice flowing without slaughter. We saw Jessica and Leto and a house united, Gurney's music in a time of peace, the Harkonnen answered on Atreides' terms, and an emperor grown uneasy on his distant throne. We followed the Fremen and their green dream, a gift come gently rather than forged in loss, the great houses watching, a kinder love between Paul and Chani, and the far pale glimpse of a golden path, until the Duke's long reign settled over Arrakis. The house endured, and evening came quiet at last over the changing sand. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those bright and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like heat shimmer fading from the evening dunes. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.